Yep. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our forum this morning. We're glad you could all turn out. We have an extended event today where we're tackling a lot of different issues on a lot of different levels related to the wind industry. We're talking about state-level wind development. We're talking about national activities that are going on, as well as what's going on a regional level throughout New England. And we have a developers panel at the end of this session where you'll hear about some of the challenges and some of the opportunities that are taking place in the wind industry now. So thank you all for coming. I want to start out by thanking our sponsors today. I'll start with Dong Energy. They're our lunch sponsor. We will be having a networking lunch after the last session of the day. Dong Energy is an energy company with a strong profile across the world in renewables. They have activities primarily in northwestern Europe, and their portfolio includes offshore wind, bioenergy, and other energy solutions. We also have our gold sponsors today are Eaton Peabody. They are a Maine-based law firm with more than 50 attorneys serving New England and Atlantic Canada from offices throughout Maine, Augusta, Bangor, Brunswick, Ellsworth, and here in Portland. They offer legal and consulting activities across a diverse set of practices, including, for purposes of this group, environmental and land use, government relations, business and economic development, natural resources, and municipal law. Bill Ferdinand has been on the E2Tech board for many years, so thanks for your support. We also have Avangrid Renewables as one of our gold sponsors today. They are really involved all over the world as well in clean energy infrastructure. They have nearly 60 renewable energy projects for its utility-scale customers across the United States. They're one of the leading providers of clean renewable wind power in the U.S. with more than 6,000 megawatts of wind and solar-powered facilities. They also have natural gas-fired generation in different areas of the country as well. We have as our platinum sponsor today, Stantec. Stantec has about 22,000 employees working in 400 locations across 6 continents. Their services include engineering, architecture, interior design, landscape architecture, surveying, environmental sciences, and the list goes on and on. So it just shows how active they are across the energy and environmental sector. They also have offices here in Scarborough and Topsom, and I believe one up in Caribou. And Brooke Barnes is active in several organizations across the state, including E2Tech and one of our partners, the Maine Ocean Wind Industry Initiative. We're going to take just a quick break and have Nathan Henderson come up from Stantec to give some opening remarks. Nathan? He's a business development leader and offshore leader at Stantec. So he'll give a couple of remarks.
Did you get that, John? My 9-year-old is very excited for me to be talking to you. He's obsessed with renewable energy, and not sure where he gets that, but you know, there's a lot of buzz here within the offshore energy space. Professionally and personally, I've been involved in seeing this develop over the last 15 or so years. A lot of disappointment, a lot of optimism, then crash. It's changed. The face of offshore energy is changing. Our firm has been lucky enough to be involved in the first offshore energy project in the U.S., Block Island. And we're also helping that developer with another offshore energy project in the state of Massachusetts. And I know there are others in this room that have worked on that as well. So it's real. It's real to us. And I think this forum, which was put together by Brooke and others, I'm excited for it. Talks about obviously bringing together the U.S. Opportunity, but brings it back home to this state. With the business opportunities that we see, I've attended many conferences. Recently, a conference called the Offshore Business Partnership for Offshore Wind. Many of you go to that as well. And in that, there are counterparts in Europe who are putting metal in the ocean, have really laid the pavement for what we see as finally competitive offshore wind being real in this state. This state and in the U.S. One of the things that also came up, and I shared this with some of our colleagues at Stantec, I attended a BOEM workshop. BOEM is the federal agency that's responsible for the development of offshore energy in national waters. They rolled out their criteria for how they see the next round of leases going out. So a lease goes out by BOEM, a developer comes in, hopefully purchases it, and develops that as an offshore energy facility. Nowhere in their criteria did they say potential for energy. I mean, if they had, this state would be ranked first, right? We know that. It's windy. But it's not. Rather, they're focusing in, and this is the industry has to focus in on those states that have energy policies for renewable energy. Maryland, Massachusetts, New York, Rhode Island in particular. So I'm excited about the dialogue that we're going to hear today, the challenges that we see in this state as we hopefully ride that wave as a firm. We're seeing it for sure. It's a great opportunity, and we're excited about it. So with that, I will kick it off. So thank you.
Thanks, Nathan. I also want to mention our silver sponsors today. Sprague Energy is a silver sponsor, and the Northeast Clean Energy Council. Our media sponsor today is the Portland Press Herald, and we have a representative from the Portland Press today. Our partners, and I won't go into detail on our partners for this event today because Val Stori and Ben Brown will be up here moderating different sessions, and they'll talk about their groups. But we're partnering today with the Northeast Wind Resource Center, as well as the Clean Energy Group and the Maine Ocean and Wind Industry Initiative, so you'll be able to hear more about those groups later. And we'll get right into the first session here, which is the state of wind energy in the U.S. And I'm going to give your full bio here because, oh yeah, we'll do that. One, because it's impressive, and two, because you came all the way from Colorado yesterday and you're heading back today, so unfortunately you're going to miss a beautiful Maine weekend. But Suzanne Tegen is the Wind and Water Deployment Manager at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. She has her PhD in energy policy and is a policy analyst by training. Researches wind power issues such as radar, wildlife, grid integration, and public engagement. She conducts research on the wind and water power domestic workforces and what it takes to get to a renewable energy future. Workforce jobs, sustainable jobs are a big issue here in Maine, so any input that you have on that today would be welcome. Suzanne has provided testimony for the Colorado Public Utilities Commission, worked with the National Academy of Sciences, won the Clean Energy Education and Empowerment Mid-Career Award from the Clean Energy Ministerial. Before joining NREL in 2004, Suzanne was with the Center for Resource Solutions in San Francisco. So impressive resume, and we're looking forward to hearing what you have to tell everybody today. We also had the pleasure of having dinner last night with Suzanne, a group of us. And I believe you've been to Maine once before, when you were 16. And you might get into a little bit more detail on this, but she was dropped off on an island as part of the Outward Bound program. Very little food, if any. An apple. Very little water. No social interaction for 4 days. I believe you were eating sea kelp and other things. You mentioned you might have had one bug as for a little bit of protein. So that was her first exposure to Maine. And so we thought, well, this has got to be easier than that particular trip. So this should be a piece of cake. But then I saw Jim Lebrecht in the audience. And Jim is known for his hard-hitting questions and probably has some questions on wind, so it may not be as easy as that island. You might be wanting to have some sea kelp a little bit later. So I'll welcome Suzanne up here, and looking forward to it.
Thank you. Yes, I might want to escape back to Hurricane Island. I think about it often, though. Outward Bound is one of those experiences that changes your life, especially when you're a social 16-year-old and you're put on an island for 4 days. So, but I don't think I'm going to focus on that. So this is where I work. This is right outside of Boulder, Colorado, and it's part of the National Renewable Energy Lab. We're a laboratory of the U.S. Department of Energy, so they own our facility and they fund a lot of our projects. And this particular facility isn't the main facility. The main one is in Golden, where we do solar and biomass research and a lot of other research. This is the National Wind Technology Center, and I work in one of those little white buildings way down at the base of the wind turbines. But just to tell you a little bit about NREL, we do analysis, we do research and development, and really basic science on all of what you see here. So energy efficiency, vehicle technologies, storage, and of course today we're going to focus on wind, but we also do marine hydrokinetic and hydropower, and then the other renewable electricities as well. So this is a map of the wind energy capacity at 100 meters, and we have both onshore and offshore represented here. I'm going to talk first about onshore wind, and then we'll go into offshore wind a little bit. And also I wanted to let folks know that I'm borrowing slides and data from my colleagues, both at NREL and then also at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. There's a market report that they put out called the Wind Technologies Market Report, and it's referenced here, but by Brian Weiser and Mark Bollinger are the primary authors. But that's a great source to go to for all things wind technology and markets. And they don't have their 2017 version out yet, which will cover 2016. They've got the 2016 version out that covers 2015. So some of my slides are kind of covering up through 2015, and then some will cover up through 2016. Also, the American Wind Energy Association is another great place to go for wind information and data. This slide is from them. And this just shows the total U.S. installed wind capacity through 2016. You probably can't see all those numbers, but 2001 is where this chart starts at about 4,000 megawatts, so 4 gigawatts, and then it goes up to 82 gigawatts. And then I think by now we're up above, we have more than 84 gigawatts installed in the U.S. right now. And what you see, the little bars down below are the quarters. So usually we install the most capacity at the end of the year in the last quarter. So those green bars are the fourth quarter. People are trying to get their projects in by the end of the year. So that's a good motivation. And where are we installing this wind? Mostly in Texas. Texas has almost 3 times as much wind capacity as the next highest state, which is Oklahoma. But you can see kind of down the list, it's Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Iowa, Colorado, and those ones are often in the top 5. And Maine is definitely on the list there as well. And again, this is from the end of 2015. So one of the things that this slide also points out is that in Iowa, 31% of their in-state generation came from wind, and it worked just fine. They didn't need storage. You can generate your power from wind. It can power your homes. And of course, wind isn't the only thing on your grid. You also have baseload power from natural gas or coal. But it's been really surprising to some naysayers. There are a lot of states now that are getting their power from wind energy more and more. And so I know in Maine you do as well. I think it's around 13% or something. In Colorado, it's also increasing. But a lot of states are getting between 10 and 20% of their electricity from wind energy, even though the wind doesn't blow all the time, and it's working just fine. And then you can just kind of see the statistics here, and again, those will increase. Those have increased, and you'll see that in the next market report, which should be out this summer. I was asked to talk a little bit about policy, and we won't focus on this too much. You may, if you're a wind person, you've seen this chart before. This is the impact of the uncertainty of the production tax credit and how the tax credit kind of stopped and started. The production tax credit gives it's a generation tax credit for wind energy. And so you can see this is the capacity in each year. It starts with 1998 and goes to 2014, and you can see when this federal incentive expires, there's not a lot of wind put in the ground. And there is much more wind, of course, when the PTC is in place. And there's been a lot of debate about the production tax credit and how useful it is. And as the scholars in the room know, every energy has federal subsidies. It's not just renewables. And what the regulators decided to do and policymakers decided to do is ramp down the production tax credit. So give one last sort of burst of the production tax credit and then ramp it down. So wind projects that started construction in 2015 and 2016 are going to receive that full value of 2.3 cents per kilowatt hour. But for projects that start this year, they're only going to get 80% of that value. And projects that start, they're going to ramp down by 20%. So in 60% in 2018, and then 40% in 2019, and then after that in 2020, the PTCs, or after 2020, the PTC is going to be phased out. This is a map of renewable portfolio standard policies in the United States. And also U.S. territories. So 29 states plus D.C. and 3 territories have renewable portfolio standards. It's hard to read over there on the right, but you can see in Maine it says 20% by 2017. 40% by 2017. And then many, more than half of the states have these policies, and they have helped with cleaner air, whether you want to put that in terms of carbon or not, but they've helped with cleaner air. And Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory has a great report on what RPSs, or Renewable Portfolio Standards, have done and what their impacts have been on the country. So some have extra credit for solar, and of course some now are starting to have extra credits for offshore wind as well. Some are a standard that the utilities, investor-owned utilities in those states have to meet, and then some are state goals. They couldn't maybe pass a standard, but they wanted to pass a goal. So these have really helped to drive wind energy development. I'll talk now a little bit about what's happening technology-wise for wind. Wind turbines are getting larger. The rotors are getting larger, and the towers are getting taller. Of course, as you go up, the wind gets stronger, and so you can see on the left scale there that's the nameplate capacity. So where the turbine is rated, and then the average rotor diameter and hub height are also increasing. And this goes through 2016, so this is from the forthcoming report, and I think was also published at Wind Power this year by Ryan and his team at LB&L. This is just another way of kind of saying what the last slide said for the people who are more visual. But in the 80s and 90s, turbines were obviously a lot smaller. You can see the Statue of Liberty there. And 2015 shows that we're right now around 2 megawatts. I think that's the average size turbine in the United States. So it's actually a little bit bigger than that right now. And then we're going to get bigger and taller. So we'll have to put in fewer turbines for the same amount of electricity, which is good. But we'll also need to put in more wind energy in general to meet some of our energy goals. And that was, I guess I should say, this is just for land-based wind. For offshore wind, they're obviously much bigger than this. The Block Island turbines are 6 megawatts. So here, this is a chart of capacity factors, which are increasing over time. So the technology is getting better. We're putting wind turbines in places that are designed in particular for those turbines. And one thing that's been happening too is that low wind speed turbines, so turbines designed specifically for low wind speeds, are being used in higher wind speed areas. And so they're finding the energy capture is larger there, and they can make more money and produce more wind. So the capacity factors keep improving there. And the capacity factors now are, some of them are above 50%, which some people thought would never happen. So the technology's definitely gotten a lot better. This is about cost reductions. So you can see that the capacity weighted average project cost is that red bar. It's kind of gone up and down, but in the last decade, it's really coming down. And right now we have really low wind costs, and that's why we have so much wind going in. People aren't doing it because they just think wind turbines are really beautiful. They're doing it because it makes economic sense. And I think I'll skip over here. So this is also about cost, and I wanted to just skip to it. But this is from the 2016 report about 2015 from Lawrence Berkeley. But here they're looking at the wind prices and that they're competitive with future natural gas costs, which are in the bar there. This is the annual energy outlook by the Department of Energy. And that blue-gray bar there is where they think that the natural gas costs will go in the future out to 2040. And then the red is the existing PPA, the power purchase agreement prices. I'll go back to this one. So this shows the kind of the regionality. Wind, and like we've seen, the wind costs and prices are low, especially in the interior, which is the purple circles. I know this looks kind of like a funny wig, but if you look at it for long enough, it really makes sense, and there's a lot of information there. So in 2016, the average price was $21 a megawatt hour, or 2.1 cents a kilowatt hour, which is really inexpensive. And then you can also see there the different regions. So the Northeast is the blue dots, and they're scattered, but we bolded those and the Southeast because there aren't as many of those projects, so they would have kind of gotten swallowed up. But this is a great one, and this one has also been published, so is available. This is from a presentation that Ryan gave at Wind Power. And that one again. So one of the advantages of wind as an energy source, especially right now in our current environment, is that a lot of it is U.S. made. They still kind of have this Made in America label. The towers have 80 to 85% on average domestic content. The blades and hubs 50 to 70%, and then the nacelle 85%. So a lot of what goes into the nacelle, a lot of those little parts are not from the United States. Those are imported. But we have a project in Colorado they just started pouring the foundations. XL Energy owns the project, and that project is going to be 600 megawatts. It's called the Rush Creek Wind Farm, and the towers and the blades are from Colorado. So the impact to that state is going to be huge. The economic benefit, the economic impact to that state for manufacturing, for rural jobs, for rural landowner payments and land leases and property taxes. So that doesn't usually happen. Usually when there's a wind project that goes in, we're importing, at least from other states, the components. But this year in Colorado and next year when the turbines actually go in, we'll be able to study that. So that's one of the things that I'm working on and have a couple of graduate students working on with me, and I'm really excited about that project just to see how much of the economic impact will stay in state. This is where the manufacturing facilities are located, and this is not inclusive. So there are some manufacturing facilities that do manufacture for wind, but they only do a small percent of their business for wind, and so they're not necessarily listed on here. And I'm probably missing some Maine companies. If you know of them, I'd love to hear from you afterwards. But these are sort of the main ones that are tracked by NREL and the Department of Energy. And then last year, there was only one Maine facility that went in without an E, Maine without an E, that opened in 2015. So this is from the 2015 report. This year, or in 2016, we have 2 new facilities up there. But you can see that we kind of track turbines, blades, towers, nacelle components, and then other, because some of them do more than one of the components. So let's talk a little bit about offshore wind. You can see here on this map the scale, the capacity, and you can see that Maine is in a great place for offshore wind, which you all already know. So here's the global picture. This is the wind project pipeline through 2020 by country. We've got the United States on the top bars there in green. And then, let's see, the brighter blue is Germany, the darker blue is the UK, and then the red is China, just to kind of point out some of them. But these are projects that have been announced, so maybe not all of these will go in, but they've been announced. And then in gray there is the annual the cumulative capacity in megawatts. So where are the projects going in the United States? And many of you probably track this, so you probably have this memorized. But the yellow kind of highlighted circles here are the Department of Energy Offshore Advanced Technology demonstration projects, which have been funded by the Department of Energy, and we'll see what happens next year. The funding is kind of up for debate because the budget is up for debate, so we'll see what happens there. But there's a lot of information here as well. And there will be a new report coming out from Walt Musial, who works on offshore wind at NREL, and some of his colleagues, and that will be coming out this year. But they'll talk about all of these projects. And I think, as I said before, there are 5 6-megawatt GE Alstom turbines on the Block Island wind farm, and that's been going very well. It took 18 months to construct it. There were no major issues. And they did that. They did that whole thing very well. The wind energy has picked up so much offshore because of federal R&D support, because of declining costs, because of maturing U.S. regulatory policy. Our understanding is increasing about how we can permit the offshore wind farms. And then I won't talk a lot about offshore wind policy, but I'll mention it a little bit. And at NREL, one of the things we do study policy, and we do provide data and information to policymakers, but we certainly don't recommend policy or anything like that. So those questions, if you have them, can be saved for the developer panel. And then I wanted to mention that since 2015, BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, auctioned 6 offshore wind areas, and that they're included there. And there are also 2 new wind energy areas in North Carolina and 6 new call areas, which is sort of prior to the wind energy area process as well. So things are picking up, and I know the folks at BOEM are excited about this. So hopefully a lot of these projects will become reality. Here is the technical potential. So this is just the technical potential. This is without any policy. There's so much, as you'll hear from the developers, and you probably know, that goes into actually putting a wind project in the ground or in the water. And this is simply the technical potential. A lot more than technical potential has to happen. And you heard from my bio, I study public engagement, radar interaction, other siting considerations like avian and bat considerations, and of course transmission, which I think you'll hear about as well. So there's a lot to consider, but you can see there's Maine, and Rhode Island, which was the first wind project that went in, is not in the top 10, but is actually in and operating. So again, takes a lot more than the technical potential, but the technical potential does help. And Maine has a lot of it, a lot of deep water, so that would mean probably, unless you go close to shore, which could, we could have the fixed bottom structures, but there's a lot more where you'd put in a floating offshore wind turbine. And there are floating offshore wind turbines in existence in the world right now. There aren't any utility scale operational ones, but there are definitely floating offshore wind turbines globally. This is from an analysis by Walt Musial and Philip Biter and a few other people at NREL that hasn't been released yet. But this is an economic analysis where they looked at the levelized cost of energy, where it is today, and then where it's going tomorrow. And we try to get to about 10 cents a kilowatt hour, and so you can see that they can it can be achieved, especially way up here, where the wind resource is so good. Here are just some specific policies and commitments for offshore wind. And you may already be aware of these, but Massachusetts passed an act that requires the state electricity providers to get 1,600 megawatts of offshore wind capacity by 2027. And then in New York, there was the commitment to get 2,400 megawatts of offshore capacity by 2030. And that was in a speech, so we'll see how that makes it into policy or not. And then in May, Maryland's PSC gave offshore renewable energy credits to a 248 megawatt project, and Deepwater Wind's 120 megawatt project for 20 years. So another important thing, of course, in all of this is the economic development, the supply chain, manufacturing that comes along with these projects. The equipment is so large that it really does help to have it manufactured locally, or of course by really large shipping. But the ships can also be local as well, the jack-up barges and other barges. And as a precondition for receiving these credits in Maryland, the developers have to invest in port infrastructure upgrades, local manufacturing, and in workforce development. So we might see that more commonly. There was an upswing for that type of requirement for land-based wind as well for a while. And then there's sort of a list of senators here who introduced the Offshore Wind Incentives for a New Development Act to extend the investment tax credit, which is different from the production tax credit, for offshore wind through 2025. So there was an investment tax credit, and still is for solar, and that will ramp down through the 2020s as well. But there's hope that there could be an investment tax credit for offshore wind through 2025. So at NREL, we look at kind of what's been happening, and then we do analysis and modeling and talk to a lot of experts about what's going to happen, what are we going to get in the future, and why does it matter. So I'll show you some of these slides. This one's really crowded, but this is from the DOE, the Department of Energy's Wind Vision, which came out several years ago. And we looked at whether it would be feasible to deploy wind and get to 10% by 2020 wind energy for this country, 20% by 2030, and then 35% by 2050. Is it technically feasible? You know, could we do it with all of our constraints? And the star is an approximation for where we are right now. In 2017, things are looking pretty good. Of course, when the PTC expires, the analysts are predicting that will fall off of that chart a little bit when the PTC expires in 2020 or after 2020, and then the years following that might not be as good for new installations for land-based wind and offshore wind in the U.S. just because of the incentive, unless we get another one. But then things will probably ramp back up, is what the analysts and experts are telling us. Experts globally are also telling us that the costs of wind will continue to come down due to technology advancements and then better understanding around siting and then better policy if that's possible. But so that's where we are on the upper left. The offshore development in 2050, so there's an offshore wind strategy. There's offshore wind is included in this DOE wind vision, and that's sort of the blue bar there. The green is land-based, the blue is offshore. And like I said, that was done a couple of years ago. And then there's an offshore wind strategy that the Department of Energy did along with the Department of the Interior and BOEM. And you can see on the upper right there, what it says is 33% of the development of offshore wind will come from this area. So will come from the North Atlantic. 22% from the South Atlantic, 10% from the Gulf Coast, and 20% from the Pacific Coast. And right now at NREL, I'm working with Walt and a couple of our colleagues, and we're working on a project for BOEM, and we're looking at the renewable energy feasibility offshore for BOEM in the Gulf Coast, so the Gulf of Mexico BOEM office, which is really exciting. The chart on the bottom there is about jobs. So this is some of the research that I've been doing, and the wide band is just because we don't know exactly how many jobs we're going to have, but in 2012, those jobs were actuals, and then the bar, this is from the Wind Vision again, the bar is the approximate jobs that we'll have in the future. And for this one, we looked at direct on-site jobs, and so those are the jobs that, you know, if you look at a wind plant, you'll see the people working on it, the wind technicians and the people driving the trucks and things like that. And then the indirect jobs, or the supply chain, the people who are making the fiberglass for the blades, that kind of thing, as well as the induced jobs, and that's this third category that's really important when construction workers go into a town and they stay there for 6 to 12 months, or in the case of Block Island, 18 months, and they come and go, but there's sort of this boom of activity where they're eating at the local sandwich shops, getting gas from the local gas station, parts from the hardware store, so that those little slivers of jobs and economic impacts increase in those communities, and those are induced impacts. We count those as induced impacts. And they do come with the construction and then go when the construction workers leave, but there is an operations and maintenance component also. So they're not, some of it, you know, some stays, but it's a lot less than the construction. So we're about right where they thought we would be in the Wind Vision. There are a little bit over 101,000 jobs in the wind industry in the U.S. today. And that is from the American Wind Energy Association and also from the Department of Energy from a survey that they did. But so you get up to the 100,000, and then with the indirect and induced impacts, you get up around the 200,000 mark. And we haven't, you know, we're not going out and asking the sandwich shops whether that's true in each of the areas. We use economic multipliers for that. But I will tell you that for the Rush Creek Wind Farm in Colorado, we are going to go talk to the sandwich shops and the hotel owners. And so I'm really excited to get some data on the induced impacts. And, you know, is it actually true? Do these economic multipliers really make sense? There aren't a lot of reports on that. So I'm very excited to figure that out. Okay. I recently completed some interviews with, we hired a firm to do interviews with 250 wind energy companies in the United States. It was at the very end of 2016. And this is what we found. This is who is in the wind energy workforce today. A big portion is engineers. Another big portion is trade workers. And then 11% transportation and logistics workers. Wind technicians were about 8%. So the people who put up the wind turbines, the people that install the wind turbines, aren't wind technicians. Wind technicians are mostly just on the operations and maintenance side. Trade workers would be the people who are putting in the wind turbines. And then I didn't put the names on the rest of them, but I can kind of, if we go around the circle here, so this kind of amber bar that's 7% is construction laborers, other than the skilled trade workers. And then we've got accountants, sales and marketing folks, admins and clerical workers, product designers and design engineers is the light pink. And then that darker pink are attorneys. Then we've got assembly workers, applied scientists, so those are the field scientists that'll go out and make sure that they're the soil scientists and biological scientists, and also cultural scientists, archaeologists, things like that. And so kind of just goes on and on like that. I don't know if you can find yourself in there, but their education is part of this, and education and training is a small sliver in there. It's almost 2%, I think, up near the top there. And then there's communications and public relations. And I'm happy to answer questions about this. We have not finished the interview. We finished the interviews. We haven't finished the study yet, but I'll be coming out with a report sometime by the end of this year. Another thing we looked at is who makes up the occupations, what groups of people. So it's about 28% women, about 25% ethnic and racial minorities, and about 11% veterans. And those groups, people might be in all three of those groups. So those groups do have overlap. But when you look at it with where we kind of are in the country, we've got 51% Americans are women, and we've got 28% in the wind industry, 38% are minorities, 25% in the wind industry, 7.5% or so are veterans, and we've got 11% in the wind industry. And then the jobs that you see down below are just where we have the highest percentage of that group. So admin and clerical has the highest percentage. Women are 83% of the admin and clerical in wind, and then you can see kind of going down the list for civil engineers, 41% for the companies that we talked to. We only talked to 250 companies, so we definitely did not talk to all the wind companies, but 41% of the civil engineers are women. And you can see going across kind of 37% of wind technicians are veterans. And there are programs to get veterans into solar that have been really successful, where you take somebody that comes from one of the services, and after their active duty is over, it's a really good fit with solar, and could be a really good fit with wind as well. And they don't have to go through some of the training that the solar people have to go through. You can see what kind of background they have and what kind of ranking they have, and then they kind of can fit you in. So you do have to do specific training for that technology, but it's maybe not as long as it would be if you hadn't been in the services. So we also did an education and training questionnaire to about 100 about 100 institutions, educational and training institutions around the country. And we asked them where their graduates go and things like that. So I'll talk a little bit about that. But we asked in this employer survey with the 250 companies, we asked them, who are you hiring? And do you ever hire people who don't have wind experience? Would you rather hire like just a really good engineer, or do you want somebody who has engineering experience? And so these are the top jobs where they really wanted wind energy experience specifically. Professors, teachers, product designers, design engineers, and wind technicians. And so these folks are supposed to have, wind experience already, which makes sense. You don't want your wind technician not to know how to climb a turbine, right? And here are the education and training programs in the US that we know about. And again, if you have an education and training program that's not on this map, this one has 189 on it right now. And I would like to put you on here if you're not on here. Puerto Rico, I think, is not on here, but we have a bigger map that does include that. So this is where they are right now. And one of the things that we asked employers is, are you finding enough people here to hire with wind experience or with a wind energy education? And they said, no, they're not. They sometimes look to Europe or other countries to hire people. Germany and India, I believe, were the most common to fill their positions, because in the US they have found that that people are not educated in wind energy, at least as much as they would like them to be. And so then we went to the educational institutions and said, do the wind industry companies come here? Do they tell you what they're looking for? And they said, no, they don't. So the wind energy companies and the wind, the folks who are studying wind kind of need this match. We need like a windenergyjobsmatch.com or something where they can come together. And even at the career fairs at the university, or talking to the career counselors at the university, that could be a really good role, I think, for the wind industry, so that students know that there is this job called a wind energy engineer or a design engineer or something like that. There are programs where you can get a master's in wind energy. There aren't very many of them. There are programs where you can study it in your undergrad and, of course, at the PhD level as well. So this is just a listing of what the Department of Energy and NREL do to kind of help this issue, where we're bridging the gap between people who might be interested in wind and people who need wind workers, and we're trying to get them together, and also just let kids and older students know that there is a job for them in the wind energy industry. There's something called the Wind Career Map, which is it's over to the right. There's kind of a screenshot of that, where you can kind of click on one of those dots. It'll tell you about the job, and then it will also tell you if you want to move from being a wind technician to a wind engineer or something, what do you need to do for that? Where do you go, and or what type of degree do you need, or what kind of training do you need? There's also a model that I work with called the Jobs and Economic Development Impacts Model that estimates jobs and other economic development impacts to counties or to states or to the whole US. It's also we have it for other countries as well. And then we also have a biweekly newsletter that goes out to over 16,000 subscribers, and you can get there easily if you just Google Wind Exchange or whatever search engine you use. But Wind Exchange also talks about something that I'm not talking about right now, but the impacts from wind. And so there are, and in my bio was also mentioned that I study this, radar. There are sometimes there's radar interference with the blades that can happen, and this process is now a lot smoother than it used to be. The wind developers know to negotiate with the DoD and FAA, and so we don't have as many radar issues as we used to, but it can be an issue. And then there are the avian and bat issues that are associated with wind, and there are lots of organizations working on those, including the American Wind Energy Association and the American Wind Wildlife Institute, and lots of other ones. So we partner with those organizations when we want to hear, what the latest is on how things are going with wind and wildlife. And we have a few initiatives that come out of NREL. One of them is called Wind for Schools, where we partner with an organization called KidWind, and we're trying to inspire and motivate kids. This may be familiar to you. I know when I was young, the big thing that our generation kind of did was we would go and take our parents' cigarettes and break them and then put them back in the box, and our parents were really mad. But eventually, teaching kids that smoking was really, really bad did have an influence, and your kids always, nagging you about something really does make a difference to the parents. Then when I was kind of in college, I worked for some organizations that talked about recycling, because we didn't do that when I was really little, but But that was another thing where it's like this younger generation grew up recycling. That's just what they do. And so they would never think of throwing away a can or a newspaper or something like that, but their parents did. And so it was kind of nagging like that. And there's some things like that that the younger generation can help the older generations get used to, something like not smoking or like recycling. And wind energy or renewables is kind of one of those things where you don't have to be scared of seeing a wind turbine. They are fascinated by the technology from when they're really little, from pinwheels to trying to understand forces and things like that. And I go into my girls' classrooms and talk about wind, and I've done it ever since they were in preschool, and now they're not that much older. I have a third grader, but they really like it. And for one of our vacations, we went to Block Island, and we got to see from the island. We were watching, and the nacelle was lifted onto the first tower. It was beautiful. It was so amazing to see. So that was really fun. That was exciting for them too. So we also have a collegiate wind competition, and the photo in the lower right is from that, where we have people, undergraduate students competing. They design and then build and then test a wind turbine at the MOWII Wind Power Conference every other year. And that's really fun, getting the undergraduates involved and their professors as well, and having these teams compete. So that's been really fun. Then there's this organization called the North American Wind Energy Academy, and that's mostly for graduate students and professors. This year they're having a conference at Iowa State. And that's so that students can present their work without paying a lot of money to go to a big conference. They can do posters, they can do talks. So that's a great way for them to exchange. And then this is, there are a lot of partners that we have. I won't go into all of them. I guess I'll mention the Women in Renewable Industries and Sustainable Energy. It used to be Women of Wind Energy, or WOWI, and now it's RISE. But I'm on the national board of that organization, and that's been really fun, where we just look at how many women are in the workforce and how can we get more women into the workforce and advance women as well in the workforce. And then there's the AWEA Workforce Committee. So we're engaged with all types of groups, and especially the one that's running this organization. So thanks again for having me. And I'm happy to answer questions or talk to people afterwards, or whatever time permits.
Thank you for the incredible overview. We do have time for one or two questions. Yes, there is a microphone over here and one over here.
Hi, Ms. Tegen. Thanks for being here. My name's Ryan Wallace. I'm an economist, and I direct the Center for Business and Economic Research here at USM. I'm also an offshore wind energy Eigert doctoral fellow down at UMass Amherst. So I've been steeped in this for a number of years and finishing up my PhD soon. But I'm always just curious, what do you see are, from an economic and policy standpoint, what do you see are the big knowledge gaps, both, I guess you guys are working on this nationally, but maybe on a regional perspective? Do you have a sense of, what are the overarching research questions, the knowledge gaps that you see for Maine or New England? I wonder if you could speak to that.
Yeah, for the industry, for the wind industry?
Yes.
I think you'll probably hear about some of them later, but a big issue I think around here is transmission, grid integration. So that's probably, that's a huge one. And then there's the intersection, of course, of politics and policy. And so we don't really venture into the politics part of it at NREL, but in academics you can. So I think that's a really interesting question. I think that our siting and permitting and zoning is going to have to get a lot better. And that's, really for all energy projects, but wind stands out because it's so tall. And of course, the more we build out wind, the closer we get to everything, right? We get closer to wildlife, we get closer to people, we get closer to, so we have, what we used to call kind of competing uses, whether that's farmers, ranchers, fishermen, birds, whatever it is, but really we could call them coexisting uses. People have found that they can coexist. But developers have gotten so much better at this over time, but I think there's still room for improvement where they involve the local communities right up front. And I know with the Block Island project, that's how it happened as well. And maybe you've studied that, but yeah, you have, okay. So I'm probably not saying anything new, but I think in this region, mostly it's the grid integration issues, probably.
Okay, thank you.
Time for one more question. Jim?
Yes. What are you seeing for a change in the BETS limits as you double the capacity factor? And the reason why I ask is that it's easier to fool a system when you can simply put a smaller generator on and increase your capacity factor, but you're not producing any more power. So what do the BETS limits look like on the difference in capacity factors?
Yeah, so I'm not an engineer. Sometimes I play one on TV, but right now I'm not going to play one. But we do have folks that could answer the question in particular for these turbines about the BETS limits. And we do have people who call us all the time and say, "Hey, I've got this great new design for a wind turbine. It's awesome. You know, the capacity factor is 90% or something." Right now, you know, we're more like pushing at 50%, which is possible. I mean, that doesn't defy the BETS limit. But there are, you know, people who will call us with their great ideas, and we have to say, okay, 20 years ago, somebody else tried this, and it doesn't work. But I don't know for the particular turbines, you know, a lot of them are in the Midwest where the resource is really good. And so I would say, you know, I think the 55% capacity factor is not defying any BETS limits. But if I can give you my contact information afterwards, or you can contact me, people can give you the power curves and that kind of thing for the turbines.
Well, thank you. We started about 20 minutes late, so we're going to move right on to the next panel. Everybody give Suzanne a big round of applause. And if Val Stori could come up and Alan McBride from ISO New England. Val serves as Project Director for Clean Energy Group in the Clean Energy States Alliance. She also co-leads several offshore wind initiatives, including the Northeast Wind Resource Center, which is one of our partners for today's session. So I'll turn it right over to Val and Alan.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. It's great to see such a good turnout here in Maine. I want to make my opening remarks short and set the regional context for this next presentation. The next presentation, as you've heard, is going to be by Alan McBride from ISO New England, and he will be talking about the interconnection queue, particularly ISO New England's clustering proposal, which seeks to reduce transmission constraints on the grid. So, the Northeast Wind Resource Center and the Clean Energy States Alliance. I work for Clean Energy States Alliance, Clean Energy Group. We are a national nonprofit that works with state clean energy groups across the U.S., and we are based in Montpelier, Vermont. And I've been working particularly in offshore wind for the last 7 years or so. So I wanted to set the regional context for this next session. And as you heard from Suzanne, I want to start off with some statistics. At the end of last year, New England, the Northeast actually had about 2,900 megawatts of installed wind capacity. And in addition to that, 30 megawatts of offshore wind power, very exciting, from Block Island Wind Farm, which, as you most likely know, is the nation's first offshore wind farm. In addition to the installed capacity, there's a huge pipeline of offshore wind projects and land-based wind projects in the queue. In particular, there are 7 BOEM leases, which you heard about, and those are in New York, New Jersey, Rhode Island, Massachusetts. And then there's a state project proposed here for Maine waters. And that represents a total of about a little over 4,000 megawatts, and they're in various stages of pre-construction and permitting and various pre-development stages. And though the wind potential in the Northeast, as you saw, is great, there are several challenges that both land-based wind and offshore wind faces, and you'll hear particularly about the land-based wind challenges. They both share in common public acceptance challenges and complex permitting challenges. And then in addition, unique to land-based wind, there's siting and interconnection challenges, and then for offshore wind, there's the challenge of high costs and infrastructure to support large turbines and a large and complex permitting and construction process. Getting to sufficient scale is key to driving down costs, as we've seen in land-based wind and as Europe has experienced in offshore wind, and as many studies have pointed out. And we work with the region and state energy agencies individually on how to get to a scale of sufficient size to drive down costs. And as Suzanne mentioned, there's been exciting legislation and bills in the last year, including Governor Cuomo's commitment, his announcement earlier this year of 2,400 megawatts by 2030 for New York, and then Massachusetts legislation for 1,600 megawatts by 2027. Some of you may be aware that Massachusetts utilities jointly released a draft proposal for offshore wind solicitation, which lays out the framework for getting to 1,600 megawatts by 2027. Other regional joint activities for procurement that you may be aware of: last year or the year before, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut issued a joint solicitation for Class 1 renewables, and several land wind projects won those contracts. Similarly, with the Mass legislation, they are talking about joint procurement, possibly with Rhode Island and/or Connecticut. Particularly through the Northeast Wind Resource Center and the organization I work for, we've been working with Rhode Island, Maine, New York, and Massachusetts on a multi-state project for offshore wind that looks at how these states could collaborate and coordinate for getting to sufficient scale. And later this year, we'll be releasing a series of reports, which we're very excited about. I'll just briefly introduce them. We haven't released any yet, but there's a regional market characterization report that looks at the market potential for offshore wind in this area and then lays out several pipeline scenarios. And then the subsequent report looks at that pipeline and says, okay, if at these penetration scenarios, what is the impact on cost? And from there, we're collaborating with the states to develop a policy roadmap that lays out the potential collaborative actions in 8 policy categories that these states could work on together to achieve economies of scale. And then as the project moves forward, we look forward to wrapping in other states like New Jersey and Connecticut and New Hampshire, which are currently not part of this project. In addition, and you might have listened to our webinar earlier this year, we also commissioned a vessel study that looked at, took the pipeline scenarios in the regional market characterization report and looked at, is that of sufficient size to support the development of a Jones Act compliant heavy lift vessel for the US. And that report, the draft results are out, and to build such a vessel in the US would cost about $220 million, and you'd need about 10 years of guaranteed work, or about an 8,000 megawatt pipeline in the region to support the development of that vessel. And in addition, similar to Suzanne's economic study, the region is very interested in what is the impact on jobs for our area. So the last study that we'll be releasing, we're just reviewing a draft now, again takes a look at the pipeline scenarios we've laid out in the other 2 reports and looks at direct jobs. What are the direct jobs for the region? So stay tuned for those. I'm happy to talk with folks offline and give you a few more details. So with that, let me introduce Alan. I have your bio right here. Alan McBride joined ISO New England in June 2006, and for the first 4 years, his primary responsibility was project manager of new generation qualification for the forward capacity market. In 2010, he became the manager, area transmission planning for Northern New England. He is currently the Director of Transmission Strategy and Services, and he's responsible for the oversight of the interconnection process for new generators and new elective transmission upgrades. He has over 22 years of experience in various aspects of power transmission system analysis and transmission services. He holds a BS in Electrical Engineering from the University College Dublin in Ireland, an MS in Electrical Power Engineering from Rensselaer Polytech Institute, and an MBA from Purdue. Thanks, Alan. We'll take questions after the presentation.
Thanks very much, Val. Good morning, everybody. Al McBride with ISO New England. I think most of you know, but the ISO, we're the independent system operator for New England. We plan and operate the bulk power system and the wholesale power markets. And in my presentation, I'm going to give a number of data points and insights of what's going on with wind from our perspective. I think a lot of it overlaps with what was introduced by Val just now. And then I'm going to drill into particular aspects that we've been working on and moving forward and dealing with some of the transmission issues that will help us to interconnect and move the proposed wind forward. So I think we heard about the policy piece earlier in Suzanne's presentation. Those are driving a lot of activity. We already have 1,100 megawatts of wind nameplate that's operating interconnected to our system, and quite a bit more in our queue. 6,200 megawatts proposed, and I'm going to give some breakdowns of that in a little while. I'm going to talk briefly about some of the work we've done on the operations side to help with the operations of that wind intermittent resource. So in New England, we have very good wind potential. It was shown on the maps earlier. It certainly ranks with some of the best wind potential compared with anywhere else in the country. What we come up against, and I'm going to walk through it in some more detail, is where is the wind potential in relation to the transmission system, and where is it in relation to the load? And here you can see, as you all know, great wind potential in northern New England, and both onshore and some offshore. Offshore wind potential off southeast New England. But the consideration is, how does that compare to where our load is? Most of our load being in the greater Boston area, eastern Massachusetts, Providence area in Rhode Island, and in the Connecticut River Valley area down to the coast of Connecticut and some parts of western Massachusetts. Already noted that Massachusetts has set a timeline for offshore wind. There was the legislation that was passed that's led to the draft RFP. This is definitely driving activity for the ISO in our interconnection queue. We are working on interconnection studies for those proposed projects. And you'll see that there are going to be studies coming out that we're being able to complete for those proposals. One of the things that enables, that I'm going to be talking about, that enables us to get through those studies is the location of those wind farms and where they are in relation to the power system. The RFP calls for no less than 400 megawatts, but up to 1,600 megawatts aggregate nameplate offshore capacity. The bids include costs for a standalone generator with its own proposals for a standalone generator with their own generator lead, or a generator with transmission that could be used by other generators coming behind the initial entrance. And those are for delivery by June 2027. So our transmission system It's our interstate highway for electricity. We have over 9,000 miles of high voltage lines. That's above 115,000 volts or kilovolts. On this map, you can see the blue lines are the 345 kV corridors, and the red lines are the lower voltage 115 kV. So the power system was developed, primarily to serve load and interconnect the utility planned power plants back in the vertically integrated days to serve that load. And so there's a lot of transmission in southern New England, in the areas of load that I mentioned. We also do connect to our neighbors. We connect to New York, obviously, and we have a transmission system in Maine that connects up to New Brunswick. In Maine, there's relatively less load, and these are longer lines, and this already had been a heavily utilized corridor for some of the existing generation that's located there, but also for enabling imports from New Brunswick. So my primary job is to work through the resources that are proposed in the interconnection queue and bring them through the interconnection studies and get them to the point of having an interconnection agreement to be able to interconnect. The ISO, that process is federally regulated by the FERC, and we are required to be technology neutral and locationally neutral. So we serve all projects in the same way in queue order. There is still quite a bit of natural gas proposed in our queue and quite a bit of wind. You can see that the wind is primarily really focused in two places. Again, in Maine, and I'm going to talk more about that, and the offshore proposals down off southeast New England. So the challenges for onshore are a combination of the nature of the technology, which is a factor, but even more so the nature of the system that in onshore, which is again predominantly northern and western Maine, the nature of the system that those projects are trying to connect to. So some of you may know the wind technology, which is now mostly asynchronously generated and connected through an inverter to the power system, performs a little differently than conventional station rotating gas and thermal technology, where it provides less inherent voltage, frequency, and inertial support. Those resources are trying to connect to that main system that I walked through very quickly, which is a set of long transmission lines with not much load that's already planned and operated up to its margin. So it's not overbuilt for the potential of future generation. It was built to reliably serve the load in Maine and connect reliably to our neighbor. Any margin that had been there has been used up by that the generation that I pointed to that's already online. In Maine itself, we have over, I think it's almost 800 megawatts of wind that's interconnected. And that has been our challenge. Now, what that's led to is a backlog of the interconnection requests, those megawatts that are in the queue that I pointed to. later in the presentation, I'm going to talk about how we're addressing that and what our solution is to interconnect that wind going forward. So in the rest of the queue, in the rest of the New England system, we've been able to process our requesting interconnection projects efficiently. We get projects through the queue on average about a year. What's been causing the backlog, as I mentioned, is the constraints that we face in Maine. So the story almost tells itself. Where the wind is proposed is in this white space that's in the north of the state and in the west of the state. And it's at some distance from the transmission system. This system is operated using kind of a waterfall or a cascade of interfaces. So we have the New Brunswick, New England interface, we have an Orrington South interface, a Surwick South interface in Maine, New Hampshire. All of those have fairly technical limitations that we have to carefully plan and operate around. They are prone to potential stability and voltage problems if they aren't planned and operated correctly and carefully. And that's led to very difficult study issues in the wind that's been proposed. So a key to solving the problem we've been able to identify is to look at clustering. We haven't had clustering in our interconnection queue. That hasn't been part of the region's interconnection process. But it is offered in other parts of the country, and we've worked a lot with our stakeholders, and we've developed, as I'll describe later, a clustering process to deal with this. In the past, some developers and some stakeholders and the ISO have been hesitant to move to a clustering solution. And I'll talk a little bit more about the complications that can arise. We're going to be filing our proposal at FERC. Presently, we're waiting on a quorum. As folks may know, that more commissioners need to be appointed to FERC, so they have a sufficient quorum to approve any filings that are made with them. So, to deal with the backlog issue, we programmatically engaged with our stakeholders starting in mid-2015 to address the factors that were causing the main queue backlog. The first phase, which we completed in the first part of 2016, we sought to address the technology issues that I mentioned to deal with the complications that were introduced by the technology that's being proposed and how it's different from conventional technology. So that we have new technical data requirements and new voltage performance requirements for the wind and other inverter-based resources, and that's already been working well for us. The second phase was to look at interconnection process improvements, focusing on infrastructure and infrastructure identification and a clustering methodology. And we've been working on something called a main resource integration study. And I'm going to give you some details on that. So our proposal is our clustering proposal is essentially complete. And what our interconnection clustering proposal will do is, where there are circumstances that a backlog could emerge or persist, will engage the clustering process. We won't have clustering in all cases. If we don't need clustering, we'll just use the queue order one-at-a-time approach that's working well in the rest of the system. So we have triggers to trigger the clustering process. if there is a backlog of 2 or more requests in the same part of the system, and if these requests need common upgrades to interconnect. And you'll see what I mean when I give you this specific example when we get to Maine. So these common new major pieces of infrastructure we're calling, we have an acronym, Cluster Enabling Transmission Upgrades. And we developed those in a regional planning study that we do in public with our stakeholders at our ISO New England Planning Advisory Committee. Once we've identified what those proposed upgrades should be to integrate these several projects, this large number of megawatts, then those projects can choose whether or not to enter the cluster and move forward towards implementation. There is an additional payment security that's going to be required at that phase. And the kind of key idea there is those projects that are potentially interconnectable, those that are ready to move forward, they can be served first. It's a first ready, first served concept. If projects choose not to move forward, they can still remain in the queue. They just would shuffle behind those that are ready to move forward, or they can withdraw. Oops, I'm sorry, that went too fast. So another key to enabling more than one new generator to move forward together is to have rules for how the costs would be allocated among them. In other words, what share of these major upgrades is each of the individual generators contributing to. We're using something that's called, this is some jargon, distribution factor methodology. You could just think of that as basically that's each generator is contributing to the cost of these major upgrades in accordance with how much they're using those upgrades. This calculates the relative impact of one project versus another on these upgrades. And if you're using the upgrade more, you'll have to pay a little bit more for it. We still have in New England, we've always had an approach to interconnection costs where generators pay all of the costs needed that wouldn't be needed but for their request to interconnect, and that's remaining to be the case. Otherwise, the transmission system is paid for by load, so any transmission upgrades that are needed to serve load are paid for by load, and transmission upgrades needed to interconnect generation are paid for by the generators. We do have, to avoid, we have a latecomer provision to avoid free riders that would come in on this major infrastructure, that they would, if anybody comes in and uses this major infrastructure after it's been implemented, the latecomer would have to reimburse those who originally funded it. So I guess the next slide is maybe it's the most tangible piece of what I'm talking about in terms of solving the backlog or providing a way forward for the resources in Maine. So we've done quite a bit of analysis to identify how can we interconnect these remote resources. The Aroostook County area, there's a considerable amount of proposed wind. It's approximately 2,000 megawatts, and we have about 1,000 megawatts in western Maine. What we're proposing is new radial 345 kV, 345,000 volt lines, one from northern Maine down to a new substation in the Pittsfield area, that's just a little bit west of Bangor, and then a second radial line, 345 kV, down to a substation called Larrabee Road, that's further south. There is some additional reinforcement that needs to take place in this corridor here. from that new Pittsfield substation down to Maine Yankee. So you can see what's happening here. The existing corridor is essentially being added to or in transmission expansion to enable the interconnection of new wind. We worked through the development of this concept with our stakeholders in the Planning Advisory Committee. We looked at several different alternatives, different combinations of interconnecting to different parts or not, or bypassing or looping in, etc. And we've landed on the choice that I described. This proposal does perform very well. This set of infrastructure, our studies have demonstrated, would enable the interconnection of up to 2,000 megawatts of proposed wind, which is a large majority of the wind that's proposed in Maine. So it does perform well. The next steps with the study is the transmission owner, which is predominantly Central Maine Power of on-grid, is working on cost estimates. Also Emera, the Bangor utility as well, are working on cost estimates for what the infrastructure would cost. And how the process will work is the transmission will cost X amount of dollars, and a project that's, say, 200 megawatts up here, because it's 200 megawatts, which is, in this simple example, 10% of the 2,000 megawatts I described, their cost allocation of the total amount would be X amount. And so those generators will know their upgrade responsibility, and then they can choose to enter into that phase 2 by making an additional deposit, or if they're not ready to move forward, they can stand aside and allow other projects to move that are more ready to go forward. So we're very pleased about this. We've gotten really good feedback from the stakeholders. I think this really does provide a lot of clarity, and it will enable a lot of things to move forward to the extent that people are ready to do so. So just in general, I'm switching gears a little bit, more on the operating side. We have done a lot of work to enable the intermittent resources that have already interconnected. Resources can now bid negatively. I'm not an operator of wind farms, but you might ask, why is it important for any project to be able to bid negatively? But my understanding is that wind projects or renewable projects may have other revenue streams, tax credits and renewable energy credits, etc., that would enable them to think differently about bidding, and we've gotten good feedback on that change. We have enabled the building of elective transmission upgrades, where a participant can choose to expand the system and pay for it themselves if they wish. And we also, in the operating space, have implemented what we're calling do not exceed dispatch, and again that has been to better enable variable intermittent resources to take on some of the risk themselves in forecasting what their output would be the next day in the day-ahead market. We also, kind of to take a step a little bit further back, this is going, the work I described is going on in parallel with a lot of other renewable energy consideration and development. Of course, I've talked about the onshore wind. I'm going to talk a little bit more about offshore. But we have proposals in our queue to interconnect hydro from Canada, and that again is enabled by the elective transmission upgrade process that we've implemented as well. A lot of this activity is driven by the major state RFPs that are out there. I should mention that the RFPs are not, like for example, the Massachusetts RFP for renewable energy and for offshore wind. Those are not ISO processes. Those are processes that are run by the states and those state distribution companies. The ISO does provide input to those processes as they request it, providing information about that's in our interconnection queue, for example. But those are the RFPs, the requests for proposals themselves are run by the states. I guess this is just a little bit more on offshore. I talked about how the offshore wind is located down here and seeking to interconnect to these points in southern New England. That is relatively much closer to the more dense part of the transmission system that I showed you earlier, and to the parts of more concentrated load down here that I showed earlier. And that is enabling those studies to move forward more quickly. We don't have the complications there that I talked about in relation to the Maine corridor. And so, as I said, you'll be seeing some studies coming out in the nearer term for the proposals that have been proposed down there. So closing thoughts, hopefully I did okay on time. New England does have quite a bit of wind potential, and that's reflected in the activity in the interconnection queue. We do need significant infrastructure in some cases because of the location of the proposals, but we are pleased to be able to identify the set of a rational set of infrastructure expansion that we can stand behind for northern New England. If you do connect to near stronger parts of the system, that can reduce transmission bottlenecks and operations, and it can reduce the time taken to get through the process. And we are looking forward to implementing the clustering proposal and expediting the development of wind in constrained areas. So that was all that I had, Val. Let me hand it back to you.
Thanks, Alan. Well, we definitely have some time for questions, so we will open it up to you. Go ahead.
Yes, Alan, Ray Wingert with HDR Engineering. With regard to the Massachusetts draft RFP, and I know you mentioned that's a state process, not an ISO, but I saw on your slide that that process included costs for generator leads. My question to you is there a gap to connect from the generator lead to the grid that should have been included in that RFP? Or is it adequately addressed? And if there is a gap, how do the utilities pay for that?
I don't know enough of the details of that aspect of the RFP to answer directly, but maybe to pivot over to what we do. When we do an interconnection study in our interconnection queue for a generator, we will make sure that the infrastructure is identified both for the generator itself, to bring the generator onto shore. That would be a generator lead in the ocean in this case, and the infrastructure to interconnect to whatever substation they're choosing to interconnect to, and then if there are upgrades on the network, then those will also be identified. If an existing line has to be reconductored, or if a new line needs to be built on the network. So any generator that's come through our process will have all of that information. They'll know what infrastructure is needed to complete their interconnection.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Okay. Hi, I'm Chris Reed, a UMaine grad student. I was wondering, with the infrastructure that's currently going offline, with the generational systems that are currently going being decommissioned, if you guys were going to be looking into recycling the transmission lines from those plants to interconnect with new power plants and utilizing that, if their lifespan, if there's still something left, or if they're able to be utilized.
Thank you for that question. It was on the slide, and I didn't dive into it in detail. But part of what's going on for us in the region is we have a number of the older plants are retiring. And they're retiring for various reasons: resource age, economics, environmental issues, etc. And for sure, I think that's definitely been noted by the community. So our role is to administer the requests that are received by us. We do publish information on what might be easier places to interconnect than others. For example, at a very high level, I talked about Southeast New England because of the grid density. But also, developers have identified that there are some major retirements. So we have proposals to interconnect at the point in the system where the Brayton Point Power Station retired, which is in southeast Massachusetts. And if that moves forward, if we're studying that, if that moves forward, then that would be a direct reusage of that as a generator interconnection point. Similarly, the Pilgrim Power Station over in Plymouth, we have requests in our queue to interconnect there. Again, I think developers are noting that that's a generator that was there that's retired. So yes, we don't direct that it be used, but to the extent developers see that and try to make use of that, we implemented that through our process like any other request.
Over here.
Alan, when do you expect to be able to complete the cluster study that would connect the Aroostook County resource?
So we presented a major update of the study that really supported that slide with a lot more detail, showing those proposed concepts in late May to our Planning Advisory Committee. And we talked with the stakeholders then. We're looking to have the study wrapped up by the end of the summer. And to go along with the completion of the study, I mentioned the filing of the tariff changes that need to go to the FERC. We're looking for the timeline to merge on both of those because we need the tariff rules to actually implement and move those requests through the queue. So that will happen when a quorum is in place. We're hopeful it will dovetail with that timeline that I just mentioned of end of summer, third quarter of this year type time frame.
And what would be the time frame to turn that into interconnect agreements? Or
Sure. So those that make the deposit to move to the next stage, they will go through the detailed system impact study, after which would be the interconnection agreement. And we've been getting through system impact studies, and we would expect to get through one like this in less than a year. So we'd be moving to the interconnection agreement phase thereafter.
thank you very much.
I should have asked this of the audience before we began questions, but if you could just state your name and organization before the question, that'd be helpful. Thanks.
Sure. I'm Kay Mann with Maine Green Power, and I noticed on your proposed integration upgrade map that both of the lines have endpoints pretty close to Canada, and I was wondering why they stopped there. Like if their endpoints were chosen with any thought to what may lie on the other side of the border in terms of other interconnection lines or transmission lines, or is there some kind of a virtual power wall there that we can't see between the two countries that power shall never cross?
Those lines, they went where they went to and they ended where they ended because that's where the requests are in our interconnection queue for generating facilities at those locations or as far as those locations. So our activity is driven by the requests that come to us. I think on another slide I mentioned that there are separately requests in our queue to interconnect across the border from Canada to our grid. That's something we have to consider as well, but that's I guess that's a little different from serving the generators within New England that have requested the interconnection service.
More questions? Yes.
Hi, Jim Lebrecht with the Governor's Energy Office. Can you tell me how you address the issue of cost versus value in transmission when you consider capacity factor? That is, if you have a nuclear power plant, for instance, running at 90%, that costs 1/3 the price of a wind system that's at 1/3 the capacity factor. And at what point do you say we're not going to allow that to go into the grid because it's too expensive, you know, per kilowatt hour of transmission?
Sure. On the interconnection side, we're not given the role under the FERC interconnection process to make that type of economic decision. That economic decision is under the structure is made by the marketplace, is made by the developers and the generator owners. So, to your example, if a developer decides that the economics work for them, given their capacity factor and the infrastructure that's required, then they would choose to move forward or not. The decision is given to them. We are required to identify the infrastructure to provide interconnection service up to the nameplate of the facility, because that is the interconnection service that will be conveyed to them. The economics shows up in an additional way after interconnection or beyond interconnection, in that we interconnect, as I described, but also under something that we call the minimum interconnection standard or the network capability interconnection standard. So behind the constraint, you can choose to interconnect by assuming that your project is running and your neighboring existing project is not, and resources choose to do that, and they may be making a capacity factor decision when they do that. Maybe I could interconnect there because I'm going to be running 50% of the time and my neighbor's going to be running 50% of the time, for example. And I think that resources have interconnected with that expectation. What that does lead to, though, is congestion on the power system, and we have seen and we do see congestion in this part of Maine as a result of that approach to interconnection.
Are there any more questions from the audience? Yes.
Mike Mayhew with Heliotropic Technologies. Follow-up to the last question, and that has to do with real-time use of power and the peak demand versus a base-loaded facility like a nuke, which in the middle of the night, it's pumping energy that's rarely used. Thus, though the energy may have a cheap kWh as far as the value real-time pricing, could you address that a little bit?
So in New England, we have economic dispatch. I hope I fully understood your question. Where we run a day-ahead and a real-time market where generation is dispatched based on marginal price, and so whatever is the cheapest generator to meet the level of load that we have, the cheapest incremental or marginal generator, that will be the one that is dispatched. That can lead to a number of different outcomes. If we're baseload generation may be running through the night, it may decide to run at whatever price it's running at, because it would rather not shut down through the night, but be running through the night and go into the following day without shutting down. Resources can choose to do that if they want to, or they could choose to bid differently. It does lead to some interesting outcomes in the pricing markets. You will see, if you follow the prices, sometimes you'll see negative prices in parts of the system, you'll see negative prices throughout the system on occasion. But that's because generators are deciding what their marginal price is to continue operating or to not operate.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Alan.
Thank you.
Hand it over to you, Ben, for announcements. Next steps.
Morning. So we are running a little bit behind, but we are going to take a brief 10-minute break. So please use that as an opportunity to go to the bathroom. It's going to be a brief 10-minute break, and if you're not back by then, we're going to start without you. So thank you. worst photo. It's the second worst. $50 minutes. Oh. Yep, this is the clicker. Arrows. Yep, arrows, and then
What's the...
caution's the laser.
Oh, cool, thanks.
David, do you prefer Dave or David? I can, yeah, sure. Yeah. Morning, everyone. We're going to be starting the next session right now. So if I could please have all of you sit down, I would appreciate it. Thank you. Morning, everyone who sat down and listened to what I said. I very much appreciate it. So we're going to get started. We are running about a half an hour behind, so just keep that in mind. We'll be doing lunch at 1 o'clock as opposed to 12:30. So thank you for your patience. So the section that we have at the moment is the state of wind energy in the state of Maine. I'll be moderating this session. My name is Benjamin Brown. I work for the Maine Ocean and Wind Industry Initiative. We're an industry nonprofit that focuses upon the supply chain. What that job entails for me is organizing events such as this. We also assist in organizing the MOWII Regional Conference that comes around every 2 years. And then I also assist in organizing the Business Network for Offshore Wind's International Partnering Forum. And the purpose of that is to get businesses that are involved in the energy supply chains, be it wind or other energy generators, to get them involved in new projects and to diversify into different kinds of energy industries. So it's a little bit about me, a little bit about our panelists here today to talk about the state of wind energy in the state of Maine. We have Jeremy Payne and Dave Wilby. Jeremy Payne is the Executive Director of the Maine Renewable Energy Association, where he has worked since 2008. Before joining MIRA, did I say the acronym right, Jeremy? MIRA? MREA. Jeremy was the Government Affairs Director for the Maine Association of Realtors, and he has also served in the administration of the then Governor Angus King as Director of External Affairs, and he's based in Augusta. We also have Dave Wilby, the President of Wilby Public Affairs, which provides strategic public affairs consulting services to infrastructure developers and investors, energy companies, and other organizations in the U.S. He was previously a vice president at First Wind and SunEdison, where he led state-level government relations for those renewable energy companies in a wide range of markets across the country. Dave is also was also the executive director of the Independent Energy Producers of Maine, an association of Maine's renewable power generators, and was an advisor to the former Senator Bill Cohen and former Maine Governor Angus King. You guys are going to have a little bit of, Jeremy's going to give a presentation, Dave's going to give some comments, and then we'll go into questions. So with that, Jeremy.
Morning, everybody. Thanks to Jeff and Ben and others for having me. Glad to be here. So here was the prettiest picture of wind in Maine that I could find and steal from somebody on Google Images. It allegedly is a wind project in Maine. I can't say for sure, but I threw in the old Maine wind and the Google Images, and that's what we got. So hopefully that's how every project looks to everybody in Maine. So here's where we are today. So you'll see, we've got 1 through 13, and then what was a clear indication to me that I needed to update my map when I was preparing this presentation. But you get a sense of where we are today, about 905 megawatts. You can see really that the 3 basic locations for wind in Maine so far have been really focused on the western mountains, down east, and then up north. In particular, the last couple of years, and hopefully in the next couple of years, it looks like Aroostook County is going to be a pretty big focus and the greatest chance to really jumpstart the wind industry in Maine. For a variety of reasons, it has plateaued, unfortunately, in recent times, but there's still a tremendous amount of optimism and opportunity for Maine to benefit from the growth of this industry. But it looks like, in the near term, in terms of big, big potential, that's likely to happen up north. And by up north, I'm really talking about two specific projects, but there are certainly others that are under consideration. We're talking about Pattern Energy's 600 megawatt project in Aroostook County, the King Pine project, and then EDP's 250 megawatt number 9 project. So these two, 850 megawatts would nearly double our current installed capacity. So if those projects move forward, that's a real jump start to the industry. So where does that put us in terms of the goals that we have in statutes? We've got these statutory non-binding wind goals. The goals are 2,000 megawatts of land-based wind by 2015. Clearly, we didn't meet that. And even in 2017, we've only reached about 45% of that goal. Then 3,000 megawatts by 2020, and 300 of those 3,000 are dedicated to offshore wind. And then lastly, 8,000 megawatts by 2030. 5,000 offshore, 3,000 land-based. So clearly we've got some work to do. However, these are not mandatory goals. Nothing happens if we don't achieve them. So there's been some efforts in recent times to remove or adjust these goals for a variety of different reasons. But we have advocated against that because it really serves no purpose other than to send a really disturbing and bizarre signal to the marketplace about whether we really would like to host their projects here. So the goals don't impact decisions that the Public Utilities Commission makes about transmission or long-term contracts. Certainly does not impact the decisions that the Department of Environmental Protection makes about permitting. But they do send an important signal to the marketplace that Maine is hoping to host these projects here. And that we think we can benefit from them. So here's a map showing the RPS standards, or the RPS programs across the country, 38 states with goals or requirements. And one of the biggest drivers in the region for new wind construction is the RPS, as well as the greenhouse gas reduction targets, particularly in the southern New England states. Lawmakers in these 38 states have decided that our energy mix shall include a set percentage from renewable resources. And this really helps to provide an important revenue stream for all eligible renewable resources, including wind. This occurs through the sale of renewable energy certificates. And as I mentioned, the RPS has received quite a bit of attention in recent years politically. But we really have decided collectively that this is a good thing to help diversify our energy mix and to incentivize and acknowledge the clean air benefits that we receive from hosting renewable energy facilities here. So what resources make up Maine's RPS? 92% of the resources used to meet the RPS compliance requirements are biomass. That's according to the PUC's 2016 annual report. Wind makes up about 7%. However, almost all wind projects sell their REC output to southern New England states because that's the more lucrative markets. And frankly, I never really understand why any wind developer sells into Maine's market. They're getting a fraction of the price they could get from Mass, Connecticut, or Rhode Island. So would welcome anybody's answer as to why anybody ever does that because I never understand it. So what are some of the things that we get as a state from hosting these projects? So there's been a few studies done in recent years, some more recent than others, but the Maine Technology Institute identified alternative energy and turbines specifically as a major growth opportunity, and it also found that the average wage paid for this industry is about $76,000. So that's more than double the average income for Mainers. And then in 2011, due to a lot of the discussion around the RPS, there was a cost-benefit analysis that the legislature asked the PUC to do on the value of the RPS in Maine, as well as other New England states. So really, the findings were pretty clear. Big win for Maine to have an RPS, as well as the other New England states. Over 5 years, adding 11,000 jobs, as well as increasing our gross state product by about 2%. And then our association asked Professor Charlie Colgan to take a Maine-specific look at the economic benefits of hosting these projects. So we'll get to that in a minute. But I thought maybe before we started talking about some of the statewide benefits that can be found in the Colgan report, we would just go over some of the individual host community benefits that accrue to these locations. So sometimes a project can really help a community to afford what might sort of seem like simple things to some of us, particularly those folks who maybe live in Portland. This might not sound like a big deal. But if you live in the town of Lincoln, for example, and you've been trying to hire a police officer for many, many years, and you just don't have the budget to do it, and all of a sudden a wind project comes into town and you have more income, you have more revenue that you're able to dedicate to a police officer, that's something you can suddenly do. So again, it might not seem like a big deal in the city of Portland, but in the town of Lincoln it is. Or it could even do things like land conservation. There was an agreement reached in the Bingham Wind project where there was, I believe, $700,000 dedicated to specific land conservation projects, I think in Bingham and elsewhere. Or it could even help to reduce local property taxes like in Roxbury. And then there's been other more creative approaches in recent years. I know that EDP Renewables reached an agreement with then Energy Office Director Patrick Woodcock to get a letter of support for their project in exchange for dedicating $2 million for basically home heating alternatives in the Aroostook County area. So these are just some of the innovative approaches that developers are taking. But I think one of the things that's been important in recent years is that developers are not going into communities and saying, here's what you need. They're going in and they're learning. What is going on in your community? What would be most helpful? How can we help you achieve the goals that you as your community are trying to get to? So I think those are some of the innovative ways, and hopefully we'll continue to see more of those going forward. So I talked about the Colgan report. So this is really the statewide benefits analysis that we asked former USM professor Charlie Colgan to quantify. So it really looked at the existing wind farms and then made some projections based on the most likely projects to become operational and energized. So we asked Charlie to really only analyze those projects that either had a permit and or had a long-term contract. You know, as we can hear anytime we talk to folks from ISO New England, there are many, many projects in the interconnection queue, some of which have been there for well over a decade that may never get built. So we really didn't want to have Professor Colgan produce a study that was not relevant and not real. So we were very careful to filter out the projects that, unless they had a permit and or PPA, we didn't ask Charlie to include that. But the benefits for Maine are huge. Over $1 billion in Maine paychecks, 4,200 jobs in 2015, and we're just not seeing other industries investing at this level. There's just, particularly in rural Maine, perhaps you could total up all the investment everywhere else in sort of urban areas and maybe you could get close, but you're not going to find this type of investment in rural Maine, that's for sure. The other thing that so we had Charlie do 2 of those analyses over the years, but we never really had anybody take a look at or quantify the environmental benefits. There's a lot of those plug-and-play methods that everybody has seen from probably DOE and elsewhere, but we really wanted to drill down to Maine-specific data, and so that's what we did. So we worked with Sustainable Energy Advantage to give us this Maine-specific data from 2015. And essentially, the SEA report found that Maine wind farm output in 2013 reduced CO2 emissions by 490,000 tons, or the equivalent of removing CO2 pollution from 94,000 cars. And then it's projected to jump up to reducing CO2 emissions by 2 million tons in 2020, or eliminating the pollution from 400,000 vehicles. So those are big numbers. So, I often say when we spend time debating some of these issues in the State House that there's sort of a grab bag of good news for Maine when it comes to wind farm development. If your concern is jobs, economic growth, broadening the tax base, there's something in it for you. If you're concerned about climate change and clean air, there's something in it for you. If you're concerned about energy independence, or perhaps what the next generation is going to be working on, there's something here. So this is really a bunch of good news for Maine. And then lastly, I wanted to just sort of cover some of the challenges that exist for wind in Maine going forward. We heard Mr. McBride talk a little bit about some of the efforts ISO is undertaking to try and unlock the gridlock that exists. And it seems like some of those hold great promise, but ultimately we need more transmission. If we're going to be able to deliver these electrons to where the demand is, we need to be able to move the power. Unfortunately, in about a week and a half ago, there was a story that Maine Public Radio did, which talked about, all of the challenges facing wind and how we're going to need $8 to $15 billion of transmission, which I think was grossly overstated, and they ultimately corrected their story. But the reality is, yes, we are going to need transmission. But the question is, who's going to pay for it? And that story never really covered that. And I think what we've seen in recent times from the Clean Energy RFP, from Connecticut, Mass, and Rhode Island, and in this most recent Mass RFP, it's pretty clear that Southern New England now gets it, that they can't just hand out power purchase agreements for renewable power facilities in Maine or elsewhere without also including transmission. So that's a very long way of saying there really just isn't a circumstance that I'm aware of where Maine ratepayers are going to be paying for transmission. So if anybody tells you that, you can tell them that's not true, and you understand why, because of these RFPs, that they have included generation plus transmission to address that cost driver. So that's one of the big challenges, and I don't mean to make it seem like it isn't a big challenge, because it is, and it's very real. So one of the other challenges is, of course, predictability, consistent application of environmental standards. I spend a lot of time in the State House, and you see a lot of industries coming forward saying, we need this, we need that. If you give us X, Y, and Z, we'll be able to invest this amount of dollars and create this number of jobs. The wind industry in Maine is not saying that. We're not asking for changes. Frankly, we're really just asking for the legislature to leave us alone and not make any further changes. There's a lot of folks who say, well, we just need this one little tweak on this one little issue, and then it really becomes an issue of death by 1,000 cuts. There are also those who would like to create a big gashing, gaping wound and really end the wind industry. But frankly, from my vantage point, some of our biggest challenges that we face as an industry are from our biggest supporters. I'm with you on wind, I think it's great, but I need fill in the blank. However, as I said, we're not seeking changes to the regulatory environment as it is currently constituted. The Maine Wind Energy Act requires a robust environmental review by a number of state agencies. DEP is the primary siting authority. But like all other industries, the wind industry does require predictable and reasonable outcomes based on fair and consistent application of those permitting standards. And in recent times, from my perspective, that hasn't always occurred. Whether it's about scenic qualities of proximate lakes or concerns over certain bird or bat populations, all applicants must be treated fairly and equally. And the personal viewpoints of any governor, any commissioner, or any other agency official cannot be included in the permitting decisions. The legislature sets the standards and the rules of the road. DEP, IF&W, and other state agencies implement and enforce those standards and rules. So, said simply, we've got a good standard. It's challenging. It's not easy to get to yes with DEP. Frankly, it probably shouldn't be easy to get to yes, and it isn't. But we've got a good standard now, and it is our belief that we should not continue monkeying around with that. We've got to create some consistency. Developers have 5, 6, 7, 8-year timelines. So when you're making tweaks along the way, you're impacting that process. So every little change that we make has an impact about whether a project ultimately submits an application and whether it is actually approved. So with that, be happy to answer your questions at the end, and I will turn it over to Dave for now.
Good morning. Thanks to the 4 organizations that organized this event for putting it on and for asking me to participate. They very wisely invited the most important guy to the future of onshore wind in New England, in my estimation, to present, which you saw shortly ago, Al McBride of ISO, in my view. What Al does and of course the broader organization he represents is really at the center of the issue, as we've heard, transmission and interconnection, that I think will be more determinative than any other issue of how the next decade plays out for wind here in Maine. So glad to hear from Al, as always, this morning. And the way I look at it, kind of to take a liberty with the old political saying, as Maine goes, so goes the nation, I think it's now fair to say, as transmission goes, so goes wind power in Maine. But against that backdrop, since we've already covered it a fair bit here, my role with Jeremy is really to sort of paint the picture of the context, particularly the public policy context that we find ourselves in here. And we tend to talk about energy policy probably way too much in the context of a single state, whether it's Maine or Connecticut or Vermont or what have you. But that's not really the way the electricity works. It's not the way the grid works. It's not really the way it works commercially either. So I think it's important to sort of look at the regional context because it really drives so much of what happens here in this wind sector. So I think everybody in this room kind of has a pretty good sense, but you know, just so we're on the same page, you know, we have a 6 New England state, single system managed by ISO. The vast majority of electricity that we use in this region is generated in state. There's some imports, but a relatively small amount. And within that, we rely on natural gas to keep the lights on as a region. It makes up now more than half of the electricity generated in New England as of the last couple of years. Nuke plants make up the next largest share at about 30% or so, but that's with Pilgrim's retirement likely to be going down. Class 1 renewables and hydropower are about 17%, and coal, their contribution has rapidly dwindled really to the low single digits. So we have, I think, some pretty clear trend lines in terms of the generation mix in New England, with the traditional fossil fuels, coal and oil, being very much on the decline. The nuclear fleet, has lost and continues to lose capacity, and gas really has been on a 20-year march to dominance in many ways. But just setting that aside for a second, as the reality, I think it's important for us collectively to think about what should the system look like going forward in all the important contexts that we think about these things: the economics, the environment, system reliability. What should our system look like? And in the restructured market that we've had for the last couple of decades, the tools to kind of manage this mix, I think about, you can apply a lot of different words to those tools. Complex, indirect, hodgepodge, conflicting, sometimes effective, but ultimately really important. And I view wind and other renewables, including hydro, really as right now the one alternative that can really kind of slow down what I think is a march to too much dependence on natural gas, because I think that's fraught with risk. And as I think it was Al's slide earlier showed, the resources that are pretty much 93% or something of those in the queue are either gas or wind. So let's talk about some of these tools that we do have, and really 3, right? The Renewable Portfolio Standard, climate policies, and clean energy procurement. The RPS, I think, as probably many of you know, has, if you want to put your finger on one policy that's done more to drive investment in wind and other renewables than any other state-level policy, that's it. This, I think, as folks are aware, it's a market-based mechanism that creates the demand for clean energy. And as the word portfolio in its name implies, it is at its heart, in part, a mechanism to ensure that certain levels of diversity exist in the generation mix. And by the way, I'll add parenthetically, I'm sort of talking about the RPSs of New England kind of collectively here. Jeremy has appropriately noted that the Maine RPS is not particularly influential for wind. But we're at a point today with the RPSs in this region where, and a couple of recent analyses have really looked at this in depth, as currently configured, they've really lost their ability to drive substantial additional renewables over the next decade. there's, in fact, a report that if you want to look into this issue further, the New England Clean Energy Council and Mass Energy released last month, that an increase in renewable energy certificate supply has driven prices for renewable attributes down so low and are likely to continue to. And the quote from the report is that this is going to result, or this process is going to undermine efforts to sustain existing resources and finance new renewable investments without some sort of corresponding increase in RPS demand levels. So, you know, what are the numbers behind all that? You know, roughly speaking, you know, less than a year and a half ago, for a Massachusetts Class 1 REC, you might be talking $40 or $50, somewhere in that range. As this recent report notes, the price for Class 1 RECs in the market today are around $16 per megawatt hour. So they're 40 or 50, now they're at 16, and the report's analysis suggests that they may be below $5 per megawatt hour between 2025 and 2030. So you know, you've begun to see in some of the southern New England states discussions about changes and adjustments to the RPS, and I think you're going to see that conversation going on for a while. One of the reasons, you know, the RPS is in that situation is really a success story, and that is in the clean energy procurements that have happened in New England over the last few years and those that are coming. A number of folks who've been up here before have already touched on those in detail, so I'm not going to go through those in great detail, but these procurements that have occurred have been really effective at driving investment. Jeremy's map of the 13 or 14 facilities, wind facilities that are operating in the state today, many of them can be traced, their success can be traced back to these procurements. And it's been done at very competitive prices. And it's now being expanded really into other technologies. You know, we've seen in the tri-state process, Maine grid-scale wind projects being successful. And as has been noted repeatedly, offshore wind is going to be a very big procurement coming in Massachusetts in the very near future. Just a note, you know, that has been discussed, 1,600 megawatts of offshore wind, and the hydro and Class 1 procurement opportunity, both of these were coming out of a law passed just under a year ago. Just for anybody, you know, that you know, a lot of megawatt numbers and terawatt hours are tossed around. These are really significant amounts of energy that Massachusetts is going to procure. I mean, very, very large. We've seen past procurements where you've seen 100 megawatts or 200 megawatts or whatever done at that scale. Again, these have been effective, but we're talking in the thousands of megawatts now. So it's really stepping up that procurement mechanism in a very significant way. And I think that tool is going to be around. I mean, we've got a number of years for these authorities that are already in law to play out. But there may be more in the future. In fact, just the other day, Connecticut has expanded some of their authority, particularly potentially for offshore wind and some other clean energy types. So this tool is not going away. The last policy I just wanted to sort of touch on is climate policies. And of course, their primary purpose is not about renewable energy, it's about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But, you know, and I think we're aware that this region has been, you know, maybe along with California, the most aggressive of any sort of group of states in trying to deal with greenhouse gas emissions. And we've had RGGI now for, you know, around a decade. But it's also important to note, you know, we have individual states in this region that have set, in many cases, very aggressive targets for their emission reductions. And then, you know, very notably, I think just under a year ago, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court handed down a decision that found that that state's Global Warming Solutions Act sets emission reductions targets that are binding. They gotta meet these, And the 2020 target is not very far away, right? We're in 2017, almost halfway through it. Their 2020 target is 25% below 1990 levels. And I think it's fair to say that the Commonwealth has a significant challenge on their hands to get to that level. So while these climate policies, RGGI in particular, hasn't really meant a lot, I think, for renewables directly to date, I think as Massachusetts and other states approach these deadlines for emission reductions, it's certainly possible that renewables may be more of an attractive option for part of the compliance for these. So I think it's important for us as a sector to sort of keep your eye on these climate processes and targets going forward. So that said, what does this all mean for wind in Maine? And I take it as really the future of development here. There are both signs that are frankly of great challenges. We've talked about a number of them, and major opportunities. The energy policy glass is both half empty and half full in my book. And it's going to be decided through public processes that most of us are familiar with, right? State legislatures, regulatory agencies, the NEPOOL committees. In all of these, information, thoughtful viewpoints are welcomed and encouraged, and it's incumbent upon all of us to engage. So, if a more positive future for wind and renewables, if a diverse system that doesn't put too many eggs in one basket is important to you, you need to be involved. Direct participation is the best. It's awesome. But there are a number of groups, Maine Renewable Energy Association, Renew, the Clean Energy Council, for instance, that are very effective and can amplify your views. So if you're not already part of these organizations, maybe join one or all of them. But in any way, however you want to do it, I encourage you to get engaged in deciding the future because it's important. So with that, thank you very much.
So with that, we'll do questions. So I just ask that you get up and stand up at the mic, and when you do, please introduce yourself, and then if your question is directed at a particular individual, please say so. So either Jeremy, Dave, or if it's an open one, just say it's an open question. So please.
Yeah, Ray Wingert, HDR Engineering. This question's for David. In particular, the Massachusetts procurement for Canadian hydropower. My question to you is, what is the impact on future development of renewable energy generation projects here in New England? And second part of that question is, relative to the nuclear plants being commissioned, is that power simply going to offset the loss of that base load generation in the future and have no effect on renewable energy or not?
So let me take the second part of your question first. Certainly that question of the loss of Pilgrim and a very substantial amount of emission-free energy in Massachusetts was part of what drove Massachusetts to enact that law. Not the only thing, but it was a real consideration, and I think they fully expect that that's whether it's a one-for-one replacement, but there is some replacement dynamic there. Yes, absolutely. At least from again, a non-emitting perspective. The first question, sort of what effect will that process have on renewables? Can I tell you in 7 months? And I say that because in January-ish, they'll announce the winners. And the way this is set up is it is the opportunity to bid in and potentially win a contract is there for Class 1 renewables, and it's there for hydro. And in many ways, this has long been envisioned, going back to the beginning of when it was just kind of a germ of an idea, as potentially an idea to combine hydro and wind in a way that provides, a really firm product and has a lot of really attractive attributes. So I would expect that there will be some proposals that are put in that reflect that combination. There will be some hydro-only bids. There will be some Class 1 only bids. And, we'll see where it lands, because I think until you know that, it's a little hard to say exactly what it means for the renewable side.
Hey again, I'm Chris Reed, grad student, Maine and USM alum. So I had a question for Jeremy. When you were talking about the impacts of renewables to the community, and that kind of struck me because a lot of times there's a lot of negative feedback from people about our industry. So it was nice to hear that there is some positive feedback about that. But just wondering how you deal with the conflicts of people of people negatively thinking about renewables, of like not in my backyard type of quotes, that type of thing. Is it because you're striving to make young people be aware of it, or how do you deal with those approaches?
It's a great question. I mean, ultimately, we're really talking about sort of civic engagement, and if anybody's got the fix for that, let all of us know, because I think it would be great if more people were voting on everything at the local level, state level, federal level. All of these decisions and issues before us really have meaningful impacts one way or the other. So, I will say generally, I don't really think there is a tremendous sort of groundswell of opposition across the state. I mean, there's been poll after poll for certainly the 9 years that I've been doing this, where, wind has 80% plus support across the state. I mean, sort of the joke that I make is, in every house in Maine, there's strong bipartisan support except for the State House. So, and even there, you can still find pretty good support, but you don't find 80% support in the State House. But there's really strong support across almost every community in Maine. That doesn't mean that there aren't some that don't like it. There clearly are. But by and large, I think it's incumbent upon the developers and the operators, as I mentioned earlier, to go into the community and figure out what is it that you're looking for. Are you open to any type of development in your community? Are you open to this type of development? Are there ways that we can work with you to make sure that this project fits into your vision for the community? And perhaps the answer is no. I say, wind shouldn't go everywhere. It needs to be appropriately sited and appropriately sized. So there are some places where it shouldn't go, and I think that's pretty clear.
Are there any more questions for either Jeremy or Dave? Yes.
Yes, I have a question. My question is for Jeremy. Hi, Jeremy. Hi. My name is Terry Hayes. I'm a former legislator and currently the state treasurer, which is irrelevant in terms of this discussion. But you mentioned two particular challenges, and the second one had to do with a consistent regulatory environment. So my question is this. In terms of the economic impact of Maine, when we take a bold step forward, as we did in developing wind energy under Governor Baldacci, shouldn't we determine a point in time in the future when we set a look back to say, what have we learned? And then focus on, well, based on that learning, do we want to change anything now? I think that was probably the omission that was problematic in stepping off in this direction. And since we don't have a date, would you suggest one when, in fact, we should stop and take a look back and say, what have we learned and what could we do better, so that the industry knows for certain we're going to have that conversation, instead of simply continuing to say we can't have that because it disrupts, the regulatory environment?
Sure. Good question. I think the short answer to your question is yes, I agree. I believe the Governor's Energy Office did a wind assessment in 2012 or 13, which actually did exactly what you're talking about. But setting that aside, I would say every single time the legislature comes into session in January, we get that look back whether we want it or not. So perhaps it's not as robust, but there's really no question, based on the, somewhere between 5 and 15 bills that get submitted every session, that we take a look at almost every component of the Wind Energy Act, sometime between January and April or June of every year.
I think I'm suggesting there's a way to avoid that. there's a way to make sure they are not to pass because the deadline isn't here yet, because we don't have enough data, or we've already built that into the plan as a means of managing that, I guess, based on the way you identified it as one of the two big challenges. But thank you.
Yeah, I think that's, Terry, I think you're right. Being able to do that would be great. And candidly, if I really felt like if we sort of put a date on the table and nothing would happen until then, I think you'd probably see the industry willing to do that. The challenge that we have is, with term limits and new legislators coming in, they all want to feel like they've got their fingerprints on some version of it. So while maybe you could get 100 of the 186 legislators to agree not to monkey around till 2019, the other 86 or some portion of them are going to want to have some involvement. But I think it's a good suggestion, certainly.
Jim LeBrecq from the Governor's Office. Jeremy, during your lecture, you mentioned numerous times that we told Charlie Colgan not to do this, or we told Charlie Colgan to consider this or not consider that. Who is we, and then who paid Charlie Colgan?
The Maine Renewable Energy Association and the membership of the group paid for the study. I mean, there's no value to a study like that if we're cooking the books. So from our perspective as an association, we need our credibility when we're putting it out there. And there's no question Charlie needs his. So I'm sure there are some, and I'm not sure if you're implying it or not, who would say, well, this is an industry bought and paid for study, therefore you got the outcome you sought. You could say that about any industry study ever. I think the question is, if you look at the numbers and the inputs that are in that study, you can make a determination about whether you think it's real or imagined. And I think, given Charlie's credibility and understanding of these issues, we didn't cook the books, nor did we ask him to, and he wouldn't do it even if we wanted him to.
Are there any other questions for either Dave or Jeremy? Well, with that, Dave, Jeremy, thank you very much for your time and for your comments. So the next session of our Wind Energy Forum is a wind energy developers discussion. So with that, I'm going to invite Brooke Barnes to come up from Stantec. Brooke is the former Deputy Commissioner of the Maine Department of Environmental Protection. Brooke offers Stantec clients unparalleled practical experience in evaluating critical permitting issues for projects, developing complex permit applications, negotiating pragmatic solutions with state and federal agencies, and assisting in expert witness testimony preparation. So with that, Brooke, could you please come up?
Yeah, and I'll ask my panelists to come up now as well.
I'm going to steal this, and I'm going to put cards down for everyone.
We're going to lead off with Paul speaking. Oh, wait, he's not up here yet. So we're at the part of the program now where the people who actually do this, where the rubber meets the road, the people with maximum intestinal fortitude are in front of you right now. These are the people who think that three-dimensional chess is fun and relaxing. They're the people whose favorite movie is the opening scene from Monty Python's Holy Grail, I'm Not Dead Yet, because they won't give up. That's their job, is to work hard to bring projects from conception all the way through and through to full conclusion. I'm just going to do quick intros. I know we're running behind, so they're going to be very quick intros. John Baker is a senior project developer with EDF Renewables and does site assessment, land acquisition, permitting. He just completed more than 375 megawatts of successful development in Illinois. He is also formerly with Gamesa and Acciona, and currently lives in Chicago. And Carolyn Heaps has come from Old England to New England to assist Dong Energy in the development of their lease off Massachusetts. She's with the RES Group and has more than 16 years of experience in offshore development. It's just the kind of expertise that we need to bring here to the U.S. to help us get off the ground. Paul Williamson was for many years the executive director of the Maine Ocean Wind Industry Initiative, building the supply chains and building the information that was needed to help push both onshore and offshore wind in Maine and across the Atlantic and beyond. He's now with Apex Clean Energy and is currently developing more than 200 megawatts of land-based wind in Maine. And finally, Matt Kearns, the old man of wind development here in Maine. Matt was on the Mars Hill project. Take yourself way back if you remember that, when it was basically a two-person show or a three-person show, pulling that one together. His checkered career has led him from Mars Hill and UPC Wind to First Wind to Sun Edison, and now with Long Road Energy Partners, where he is the development manager for Long Road's portfolio of both solar and wind projects. So each of our panelists is just going to have a few minutes to say whatever they want in relationship to where they sit and what they know about wind development, and then we'll open it up to some questions. So John, would you like to kick off?
Sure. Thank you, Brooke. So I guess one of the benefits of being at the last panel to go is that you can just think of everything that's been discussed before and throw a hodgepodge of maybe useless or not so useless data. So I think a lot of the speakers did a very good job, especially talking about the sort of context of where wind energy is nationally. I thought it might also be a benefit to talk about where wind fits into the larger electric mix. And as someone with probably the least amount of development in Maine, maybe look at it a little more nationally. So Dave alluded to this on the last panel, but it is true that we get about 10 years ago, we were getting about 70% nationally from hydrocarbons, coal, and natural gas. Coal has been ramped down significantly in the last 10 years, and natural gas has filled that space. But there is, we're probably down to about 62, 63% that is now hydrocarbons nationally generating our electricity. And you hear sometimes from opponents that that doesn't seem very drastic, that in 10 years you've only managed to convert 6% of the energy to non-carbon emitting sources. And from my perspective, I actually think that's pretty great. If you think of these as asset lives of anywhere from 30 to 60 years for generating facilities, realistically, you're only turning over 2% a year of your entire generating fleet. And if you can do 0.5 to 1%, which is what wind and solar are doing now, I mean, you're converting 50% of that turnover to renewables. So I think that's a great success story. And especially when you think these are fixed price assets that you can go sign a contract for 30 years that doesn't escalate. I mean, we talk a lot about what are the prices relative to natural gas today, but in 98, 99, if I had tried to sell you a 20-year contract for regular gasoline for your car and said, I'll sell it to you for $1.50, and you go, well, I can fill up at the pump for $1, that contract would look a lot smarter today. So I think, certainly a lot of people in the room are well steeped in these issues, but I know we have a lot of students, a lot of concerned citizens, a lot of government folks, and thinking about it from those perspectives, about that long-term view, I think makes a lot of sense. And then I guess just one other comment that I would have, hearing a lot of discussion about the need for transmission and the 83D proposal. So my company is very active in discussions with some of the proponents of some of this transmission line, and I'll just make a general comment after what Al McBride said and what Dave Wilby said, is that I think this is a very fascinating RFP. It is for a large quantity of energy, 1,000 megawatts. The total New England ISO grid has about a peak demand of 25,000 megawatts. So in one solicitation, they're getting about 4% of the total peak demand of the New England grid. So that's a huge quantity, but to the point of that concern about how do you integrate transmission, if you read through the RFP, which is, I've done, and it's a nice 100-page RFP, it really does give those Massachusetts distribution companies that will ultimately be signing the contracts a lot of flexibility in how they evaluate both hydro from Quebec or from New Brunswick, how they evaluate the value of wind, how do we integrate the cost of transmission into that, not just the transmission line itself, but those network upgrades that might be required to actually deliver it to those demand centers. And really, if you ask any of the developers or transmission owners, and you ask each other, well, how are they going to solve this issue? How are they going to weight the different criteria? And the truth is we don't know, because they do want to give themselves a lot of flexibility, but we think there'll be a lot of Class 1 renewables, wind and solar, as well as a good portion of hydro that's included. So that's initial thoughts on the first 3 hours that I was listening to. Thank you.
You want me to go next? Okay. Well, thank you very much for inviting me along today. As Brooke mentioned, I've moved across from the UK. I've been living in Boston for 18 months now, working with the Dong Energy team. But I have been involved in offshore wind in the UK and Europe since 2001, when in fact I worked for the Crown Estate originally and ran the two first rounds of leasing in the UK. And obviously now the European market is much more mature in relation to offshore wind. And Dong Energy, the Danish oil and natural gas energy company, are now in fact, have got the largest global portfolio of offshore wind, and they work in attractive markets. They operate over 19 projects in Europe at the moment, and that's in almost 4 gigawatts of offshore wind. They've got a robust portfolio to build out that pipeline of projects to almost 7 gigawatts by 2020, and then a further project pipeline to achieve maybe up to 12 gigawatts by 2025. And that's actually just in Europe. But now that that market is maturing, they need to continue that pipeline. So they've been looking at other global markets. And the US came top of that list in where they should, in fact, expand. They've also opened an office in Taiwan. So the Asia-Pacific region is also recognized as another attractive offshore wind market. So certainly Dong Energy have been very much at the forefront of reducing costs of electricity. And in fact, if you've been following the offshore wind news back in the European sector, they've actually won some projects that have got zero subsidy. And that's very much related to the nature of those particular auctions. But it does demonstrate that there can be significant cost reductions in the offshore wind space over time. Dong Energy, in fact, its main headquarters is in Denmark, and they have over 2,000 employees dedicated completely to offshore wind. Even though the name Danish Oil and Natural Gas indicates that they were traditionally an oil and gas company, over the last few decades they have made a major transformation to the renewable sector, and in fact are now divesting their oil and gas interests. And I think we're also seeing some of that transformation happening with other traditional oil and gas companies now as well, who are also getting much more involved in the offshore wind sector, such as Statoil and Shell and so on. So why is the US so attractive to Dong Energy? And in fact, why is it becoming more attractive to other European developers who are now also expressing an interest in getting involved in this sector? We have got a federal leasing process in place. Suzanne earlier this morning gave a very good overview of some of the key aspects and factors of the offshore wind process. And so BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, have been leasing a number of areas, wind energy areas, which they have identified with state input through their task forces down the east coast. And also they're now obviously looking at leasing areas off California as well, and other parts of the US. So US has a very good resource, particularly here off the northeast. We're seeing very good wind speeds, and in fact Massachusetts Clean Energy Center recently fixed a LiDAR onto a platform just off Martha's Vineyard, which has been recording wind speeds well over 10 meters a second, and I think even the average for March, just for March, was 12 meters per second or so. So we're demonstrating that, in fact, there's a very good wind resource here off the northeast too. But we've also got a wide offshore outer continental shelf, so we've got good water depths which are suitable for fixed foundations. And so some of these wind energy areas are very much like some of those sites that we've been developing in Europe. As has it also been indicated, the load centres or the demand centres along the coast are very large, and so you've got close proximity of those offshore wind energy areas as well. And of course the biggest benefit is that we can actually build out very large projects. We're typically seeing now projects in Europe being between 600 and 800 megawatts. And in fact, Dong Energy will be building what will be currently the world's largest offshore wind project in the North Sea, one of the Hornsea projects, which is 1.2 gigawatts. So we've come a long way since Dong Energy installed the very first offshore wind farm project off Wilby back in 1991 to the sort of scale of projects that we're seeing today within Europe. And certainly the wind energy areas that have been identified by BOEM offer that scale and volume. I think what's also important is this movement from the states as well, in line with some of the federal leasing. So we've heard about what Massachusetts is doing with their RFP. We've recently had the work in Maryland providing OREX to 2 offshore wind projects down there. We've got a lot of work going on by NYSERDA of New York, who, with their energy master plan, identifying potentially new wind energy areas as well. And then also California is also getting much more involved, but obviously, the West Coast is going to focus on floating wind. So there's a lot of good stuff going on, but as there are always going to be challenges as well, and some of the major challenges relate to the need for a domestic supply chain. And in order to create that supply chain, I think what has been demonstrated in Europe is that we need that portfolio or that pipeline of projects coming through. And we are seeing that coming through in relation to those lease areas that have already been auctioned. But likewise, the developers need to work with the supply chain to actually identify what is required and how we can build out a very expansive supply chain. We're also working as an industry with federal agencies such as BOEM to look at the permitting regime. The permitting regime for offshore wind was developed some years ago now, and things have moved, things have changed. We take a much more of a design envelope approach to developing offshore wind in Europe, and we want that flexibility in this market too. So there are improvements that could be made within the permitting regime, but as an industry we continue to work with the federal agencies to help influence and drive that. And again, we just need to see this continued drive and momentum by the states as well, as has been shown by the state of Massachusetts, for example. So I think I've probably taken more time than I should have. But I hope that's given you a good overview and has built upon some of the aspects that Suzanne and Val raised in their presentations earlier.
Good morning. Yes, it's still morning. Good to see a lot of friendly faces and old friends coming back here. It's been very, very nice to be part of this event today. Earlier this week, Brooke and I were talking, and he was asking me some questions a little bit about my perspective on the industry coming from the advocacy side into the development side. And on kind of some minute personal levels, it's challenging at times. I went from wanting to be a cheerleader for most of you in the room and wanting to make sure everybody got a piece of the pie, and now I'm looking through different proposals from different companies and choosing competitive proposals and bids. And then also some of the people who used to be friends or still are friends have now become competitors. And so, it changes the dynamic slightly. But also in reflection to my previous experience before Apex, a lot of the focus that I spent in the previous 8 years within the industry was really an economic development focus. How do we increase the pie and the investment for the state of Maine? And now being on the end that I'm on, I actually have funds that we want to invest in the state of Maine, and it's challenging. It's very difficult to get to the position where we can provide Washington County with over $2 million in investment to get through the permitting, the interconnection, and everything that's required in order to actually allow us to make those investments in community. And Jeremy Payne really made the argument for me very well when he provided some of the statistics earlier. Some of the investments that wind power has represented and still has the potential to represent in the state of Maine are substantial, and they are really, at this point and stage in Maine's rural economy, this is the only scale or industry that is investing in this scale in rural Maine at this time, and in the foreseeable future for the next 25 years or so. There are few opportunities that somebody can point to and say there are these additional opportunities coming down the line for rural Maine. And it's extraordinarily important for the sustainability of these communities, and it's also extraordinarily important for the sustainability of some of Maine's heritage industries. In particular, agriculture and timberlands are both industries that are struggling right now in the state of Maine. And one of the things that wind power offers to these industries is to come in the large tracts of lands that these landowners own, offer them diverse income for these lands while they're still working through the issues to be competitive in their heritage industry. And so it provides an extraordinary boost to the landowners, to the industries, and to those local communities that is unmatched by anything else that's happening in the state and is extraordinarily needed in the state. And so when you look at it purely from the economic development side, and you look at this, there's the RFP that's coming up from Massachusetts, and the increased demand in renewable energy that you see in southern New England, and you realize that this is really an opportunity for economic development in rural Maine that southern New England is primarily going to pay for. It's really difficult at times, from my perspective, to understand that we are on the cusp, perhaps, of losing this opportunity. We've mentioned a number of times the Massachusetts upcoming RFP earlier today, but we really haven't talked a whole lot about the tri-state RFP that happened approximately a year ago, where Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts all put out bids for renewable energy. That RFP ended up being undersubscribed. They awarded less contracts than was their goals to award. And a number of large transmission projects and also wind energy projects in Maine were overlooked, even though they bid into that RFP. And the feedback that I've received talking to different people throughout New England and within the industry is largely one of the reasons why a number of those projects were overlooked was because of the uncertainty of grid development and the uncertainty of wind power permitting in the state of Maine added risk upon risk and made those projects too uncertain for the tri-state RFP to bid into. And so when we look at this and you kind of think about, again, the economic development end of this, and you realize here in the state we have this opportunity, unmatched opportunity to invest in our rural communities, and really what it takes is permitting certainty and trying to alleviate some of those grid pressures. It's quite frankly challenging for my own thought process to understand why we as a community, we as a state, haven't done everything we can to embrace these opportunities and fast-track grid development as much as possible, and also streamline the permitting even further and create permitting certainty for wind power to remove the risks so that people can identify sites, permit sites, and really understand what the rules of the road are, again, as Jeremy pointed out today. And so I think that really remains a challenge for us, and there's still an opportunity there. We have additional opportunities to sell Maine renewable energy into the southern grid, and again, bring that money back to Maine communities so that Maine communities can benefit from that. We have that opportunity here in front of us, but at the same time, while we have that opportunity in front of us, you'll notice that the new RFPs coming from southern New England are now starting to diversify with a higher interest in hydropower from Quebec and also offshore wind power. And I think that if we allow this situation to continue where renewable energy for Maine represents high risk and high uncertainty, those interests in those alternative resources are going to continue to grow, and our opportunity here in the state to create that investment for the rural communities is going to start to dwindle. And so it's really timely that we come forward as an industry, as a community, as a state, and do everything we can to make sure that we don't miss this opportunity. When you think if Maine had an opportunity similar to this, where somebody wanted to come in and invest $2 billion into rural communities to set up the supply chain and the manufacturing of luxury cars in the state would be tripping over themselves to try to get that opportunity. And somebody might say at that point, well, wait a second, are luxury cars really worth buying in the market? You know, do we really want to support that market? People wouldn't be asking that question. You know, frequently people will say, well, you know, does renewable energy come in at a premium? And it doesn't really when you look at the economics, but put all that aside, and who cares? Who the hell cares? Somebody outside of the state of Maine is willing to make investments in our rural communities and provide those economic development dollars for our communities. Why aren't we jumping over every possible opportunity to grab that while we have that here in front of us?
And Paul says he used to be in an advocacy role.
Yeah. Amen to that. So I'm, as Brooke said, I don't know why I'm going to do you any favors with the introduction you gave me, but I will keep it short. So I feel like I should have come up here on a walker, but I have been at it for a decade, and I started with UPC Wind in 2006 that became First Wind. My boss gave me a goal of 2,500 megawatts by the time I turned 45. So I failed miserably in that regard, but we did succeed in developing 650 megawatts, 8 projects in Maine, totaling about $2 billion of total investment. And when I say we, I mean you, because you're all here. I see Brad Kites and Carter Scott, and literally, you know, stand up if you've been involved in a First Wind project, and raise your hand, because there's a lot of people in here who have done it. And it wouldn't have happened without all of the people that are involved in this industry in the state. So really, what we were able to do in Maine was sort of by, for, and about Maine. The companies that were involved, I think there's this sort of perception that wind developers are like fancy dressed guys in the State House. It's just not true. We work with landowners, timber owners, families that need the revenue from the wind turbines. That is the most fun about a part of this business, is putting this whole kind of aggregation of interests together and sorting through the hard ones, but ultimately getting to the finish line. It is the most satisfying thing that other than fatherhood, that I've done. And you know, it's really, you know, it's pretty amazing. So in terms of the kind of what's next, I guess, I figure I'd just cede my time to the senator in the corner here, and then we can just talk about it in the panel. Thank you.
As you can tell, Matt and I have lived through a few of these battles over the years. I'll kick off with a couple of questions, but then I want folks to stand up and line up at the microphones and give this panel a good hard time. But one of the things I think we heard this morning, Suzanne had a great slide and discussed sort of the end of the PTC, the phase out and ultimately end of the PTC in 2020. Is land wind dead after 2020? Is the dramatic increase in installed capacity that we've seen over the last 4 or 5 years just going to and end? What do you think?
You know, I guess I would throw out the biggest thing that I've seen over my career is yes, there are challenges that Al aptly described on the transmission side, but I think corporate interest in renewable energy has basically radically changed the business. And so I think despite what's happening at the federal level, the state level, it's beyond that. because now it's kind of hit the CFO's office, and people want to sign, Google, Microsoft. I mean, you saw there's a full-page ad in the Wall Street Journal of companies like Microsoft and Amazon saying, hey, what are we doing? Why are we stepping out of Paris? That's ludicrous. And furthermore, we don't care. We're going to do it anyway. So I think the trend is going to continue. Wind energy is the cheapest source of energy available. I actually was joking with somebody earlier. I think the word conventional generation should probably be renamed, because conventional is no longer what we think of as conventional. There's more wind, there's more solar. So what is conventional anymore? So I think it will continue. I think that a new sort of pathway has emerged that's less dependent on production tax credits. Obviously, we're phasing them out at the federal level. Some states may continue to, I think the RPS is critical and will continue to be an important driver. But I think we found a new pathway. So New England is always going to be challenging, but.
And to follow up on that, so I did have some notes on the corporate market. And it hasn't really been discussed today because New England is so much of a regulatory driven. And you have New York, you have Massachusetts, even beyond the 83D, there's expectations that Connecticut and Rhode Island would seek more procurement. So you don't hear as much on the corporate side in New England because there's a robust state house driven policy. So I think the figures I saw, it was about 3,000 megawatts or about 4,500 megawatts of corporate purchases in the last 2 years. So again, scaling that to what's been going on in Massachusetts, where they're seeking to procure, let's say, somewhere around 1,000 megawatts. Nationally, the corporate purchasers, which have included, initially it was the Facebooks and the Googles and people who felt they really need to have a strong outward-facing corporate sustainability policy. But now you're even seeing brick-and-mortar retailers like Walmart and Target get into the game as well. And I think as you can start making it easier for not just the Fortune 100 companies, but the Fortune 500 and the Fortune 1000 companies to purchase, you'll see that market take off even more. And to the original question, the forecast I've seen is there might be a dip in the early 2020s as the value of the PTC disappears, but then in the back half of the decade, 2025 and beyond, that when you are truly just competing on a levelized cost of energy alone, subsidy, PTC aside, and when you pair that cost parity, again, with a 25-year known cost that's not subject to any fluctuations in commodity prices, it just makes good risk-adjusted economic sense.
I also agree that it'll continue. Again, one of the main things that we've seen is costs continue to be reduced for wind-powered electricity as time goes on, and we'll continue to see that reduction. The thing that's I think that at some point here that there's going to be some type of a market correction, and as the PTC fades out, as the REC prices either bottom out or stabilize to the lower point where they're going to be, there'll be a little bit of a hesitation. There'll be a little bit of a dip in the market. But one of the things that we see with the recent long-term power purchase agreements that are signed is they seem to be ignoring the market that combines RECs and brown power, and they're selling electricity at what it costs to generate electricity. And once those, we've gotten beyond that issue of the complex market of subsidies included or not included. The cost of energy will level out, and markets will pay for the levelized cost of energy, which will be extraordinarily competitive because of the way this industry has evolved.
And I'm just going to add to that because I think in my introduction I also referred to the recent auctions in Germany with the zero subsidy, and I think that's been a real breakthrough. Certainly for the offshore sector. It was enabled by a number of circumstances specific to the auction because typically it often doesn't include grid in those auctions. But I think the cost reductions and the belief that we can now deliver costs below the forecasted wholesale power prices has been a substantial breakthrough, and I think it really demonstrates the global growth potential and shift to a green, low-carbon economy and energy system that offshore wind can offer. And a lot of those cost reductions have certainly been achieved by scale. And in offshore wind, we always talk about scale and volume. It's also been, I think, because of innovation. And we're seeing much bigger turbines as well now. In fact, Dong Energy recently installed the world's largest turbine, an 8-megawatt turbine, on its Burbank extension project in the UK. But along with that innovation and scale, we've also seen a lot of industrialization and standardization of installation methodologies and things like that. So all of those things contribute to the significant cost reductions that we've been able to achieve in offshore wind in Europe. I mean, if you look in the UK alone, I think the cost reductions have been at least 32% since 2012.
Well, and following on that, Carolyn, that's certainly here in the U.S. will benefit from the European experience, both in the economics, but also what other top 2 or 3 lessons, I guess, are there that we can gain from the European experience as we expand into the offshore market?
Well, I think we do have to remind ourselves that those cost reductions have been built upon the expansion and the growth of a very strong supply chain. And that, again, has been underpinned by a stable policy. So Europe wants, all those member states of Europe want offshore wind, so they've had very clear policies to underpin that. And I think that gives that certainty. And you spoke about the need for certainty and the need to de-risk projects as well. So I think the lessons learned are really about how we can actually grow that domestic supply chain to actually create the jobs and the economic growth. We're talking about very large infrastructure with offshore wind. So the economic growth potential is enormous. And with that comes the job creation. And obviously that's going to be throughout the whole supply chain. So it's going to take time. I mean, it's taken time in Europe. I mean, I mentioned that I first got involved in offshore wind in 2001. So it doesn't happen overnight, but we can actually now transfer some of those lessons learned from Europe in terms of innovation, in terms of industrialization, working to develop a supply chain in order to also be able to see those cost reductions.
I'm going to add to that too, and I'm sorry if this counters a little bit of the prospects for offshore wind, but I had the fortune to go on the State of Maine trade mission for wind power and offshore wind power in 2009 with Governor Baldacci to Spain and Germany. And while we were there, we had a chance to stop in and visit with RES that was doing offshore wind power development. And the first thing when we all sat down in the room and they started to talk to us, the first thing they said is, number one rule about doing offshore wind development is develop onshore as much as you possibly can first. And so while I think there's a lot of prospects and I'm very bullish on the opportunities for offshore wind creating clean energy for the East Coast here, I want to remind everybody that we still have the potential for several thousand megawatts here onshore. And again, it's going to create economic opportunities for the state. It's going to be good for our environment. It's going to be good for our economy. And following the RES rule, develop as much as you can onshore before you move offshore.
But the good news is that because the Massachusetts RFP divides offshore and onshore, you're not in direct competition immediately, at least, maybe down the road. But there's separate carve-outs for offshore and onshore, at least in the most immediate RFPs that are coming up.
That issue of competition is one that I see a hidden or something to explore. On land-based wind, it's been a race to get the ridgetops. It's been a race to sign up the landowners. It's been a race to connect for interconnection. In offshore wind, I see a tremendous amount of cooperation, whether it's developing supply chains, whether it's solving the problems that are unique to offshore wind. Are there lessons that the onshore wind development community can learn from offshore wind, or are they just unique unto themselves, and the notion of cooperation for transmission or something like that, whether it's the clustering that Al was talking about or something like that, is that notion of cooperation just anathema to land-based wind development?
Well, I'll quickly say that, and again, I keep going back to this 83D because I'm sure most developers in here, that's what they're going to be spending the next 8 weeks on, and then 6 months after that.
That's the RFP?
That's the Massachusetts RFP, sorry, not to use jargon, but the 83D is what the Massachusetts RFP is. And going back to my earlier comments where generation and transmission have to partner up, but these lines that are being proposed are upwards of 1,000 megawatts, and there's few land-based developers who could satisfy an entire transmission line. So I think you are seeing companies that previously were competitors have to say, well, now our success is tied to one another. And I think that's one of the interesting parts about the RFP is that it says we're not interested in wind farms developing if there's no way to get it to market, and we're not interested in transmission lines developing if there's no way to get it, if there's no generation on the other side to deliver into the market. So when you have trying to fill up a 1,000 megawatt transmission line, and we had a question earlier about how do you make that as economic as possible, is to fill it up as much as you can. And so you do have companies like EDF very interested in what our counterparties are doing, and in a way we want to see them successful because that will make the overall system more efficient.
Yeah, I would just say, you know, on onshore, I mean, we're competing over scarce resources. So absent sort of something like a cluster or something that where it's a clear and understandable process where I can present it to our investment committee and sort of understand it and understand the risks and rewards, we're competing over scarce resources. So, you know, my instinct is to just go hard and win. But, you know, ultimately, when you do, I think creating systems that encourage reasonable cost sharing, and, you know, the cluster study may be a step toward that, greater predictability as we plan projects. Like I think somebody said earlier, 5 to 7 years is not an uncommon kind of development cycle for an onshore wind project. So, you know, the extent to which I can predict the costs of the upgrades associated with the project, that's absolutely critical, because if I spend, you know, $5-7 million developing a deal and then wind up on the, you know, 4th year in that I have massive upgrades, it's a tough day at the investment committee. So we're more likely to just stop the project and wash it away. So ultimately, I think we do search for markets where there are, and particularly now at Long Road, we are searching for markets where the predictability is much less than or is much greater than what we see in New England. It's just a very hard market to participate in, and the transmission, the lack of predictability on the transmission side and the scarcity of the resource makes it very challenging to invest.
There's been a few people who have talked about sort of the patchwork of opportunity, I guess, that might be ahead at the federal level as there's a push to sort of go toward carbon-based energy resources. And we have states like Massachusetts, we have the corporate entities that you talked about, we have local communities saying, well, we're not going to. Does it change your development philosophy or strategy without that overarching sort of federal umbrella also pushing in that same direction? I finally got him.
I mean, I think right now is an incredibly exciting time in renewable energy. I don't know how you feel, fellow panelists, but it's, I think as you indicated, the cost curve has come way down. Original equipment manufacturers are building to that point at the curve when there is no subsidy. So that's incredibly exciting. Both, I think, it sounds like I wasn't as up to speed on the offshore side, but that's exciting news on that front. So I think with Google being the largest buyer of renewable energy last year, I think, and Walmart coming into the market, and Jonathan's comments, I think, about Target and Walmart. I mean, who thought that anyone would ever be negotiating with Walmart on a power purchase, a 15-year power purchase agreement for a wind project out of Texas, or talking to Target about a long-term contract? It's pretty exciting. I think we are where we wanted to be, like 25 years ago when people wanted to tap, you sort of had the hippies, and then you had the markets, and never the twain shall meet, right? You had sort of aspirations about clean technology, and then you had markets out doing what they do. But now they're like, incentives are fully aligned. It's pretty exciting, and so you're able to walk a contract in to the CFO's office, and we did this with 3M at another company, just a huge company, Fortune 500 company, walk it into the CFO's office. CFO is able to present it to the executive committee and say, this is a good deal. It's not a perfect deal, but it's a reasonable view of, at a fixed price, I can sign a fixed price contract for 15 years for a product that doesn't require fuel, and the volatility's out. And for a portion of my electricity buy, I know what the price is, and I'll always know what the price is. Very few other generators can offer that product. So it's pretty cool. I think we're at an interesting kind of inflection point in the market, I think.
And even though this is a wind conference, I mean, I'll add, you see it on solar as well, that even just 2 or 3 years ago, utility scale was somewhere around $4 a watt. It's down to about $1 a watt today. So even on solar, which previously used to be 2 or 3x what wind was, now you're seeing, again, 20-year contracts for under 5 cents a kilowatt hour. And that big white space in the Southeast when we were discussing the state policies where there were no state policies, even some of those vertically integrated utilities that have previously been, don't tell us how to run our grid system, even they're starting to issue RFPs for solar, because there's a certain point when you can procure 20-year power, 30-year power for 4 or 5 cents, at what point do you say, all right, we give up, this just makes too much sense for us to fight it any longer?
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, offshore wind has got to be the most exciting sector to be in. Having been involved in the early days in the UK and being able to go through this excitement again is phenomenal, but also to be able to sort of bring in those lessons learned as well, because it's not just a case of transferring what we did in Europe to the US. There are, it's a different market, it's a different permitting regime, there are lots of differences, but we can also leverage off the experience as well. And I think, it is very exciting. We're talking about very large-scale turbines now. I mentioned the 8-megawatt turbine. What is it, like 600 foot high, 500 feet diameter? This is big kit. It's big pieces of infrastructure. But I think what's also interesting is that we have had a bit of a stop-start in the offshore sector here in the US since BOEM announced its Smart from the Start process back in 2011 when I first got involved in the US market. But I think, a lot is happening, a lot has come together now. I keep referring to the federal leasing program, all the great work that NREL and other agencies have been doing as well. But also, and I think that was at the outset, I used to go to conferences and people would ask some of the European developers what would give them interest in the US market. And it was typically, well, a good policy, a policy that underpins the desire and the vision for offshore wind, but also a viable route to market. And that's really where we've been reliant on the states now in order to put that in place. But of course, I think in future we'll see more of the corporate aspect as well. And I think, that is now happening. I mean, this last year or so has been amazing. Dong Energy has come into the market, which I think has given the offshore sector a lot more confidence as well. Because of their interest in it. We've seen Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners come into the market too, another Danish company. We've now got the North Carolina lease area was recently won by Avangrid, who operate, their Iberdrola back in Europe, and they've got substantial offshore wind in Europe and UK with Scottish Power. So I think now there's a lot more confidence that and certainty that offshore wind has arrived and offers huge potential. As I said earlier, the resource is very good, both in terms of the wind resource and the actual physical characteristics. But of course, I think it's something that we always have to be are very conscious of then is coexistence. And I can't remember who used that term earlier this morning, but that's really important from an offshore wind perspective as well. So we put a lot of emphasis on stakeholder engagement and that sort of community focus as well. And that's certainly something which Dong invests a lot of time and effort in, particularly with regard to the fisheries communication, fisheries liaison. So a lot of it also comes back down to good siting of projects as well. We've heard that message as well this morning. So putting these projects in the right place and then working with different stakeholders to actually ensure that you can coexist with other marine users and have minimum impact on both their usage of the offshore space as well as the minimize impact on the environment as well.
Good siting. You heard it from Carolyn and you heard it from Jeremy as well. It really is the key. It only takes one project that is poorly sited to tar the entire industry, as we've learned. Questions from the audience? There you go.
My name is Annette Bosler, and I have a question, actually, maybe two. If you look back to the Tri-State RFP last year, actually a big chunk went to solar. As you mentioned, solar costs have come down. The other big topic, obviously, in renewables is energy storage and the cost of energy storage coming down. So my question to you is, A, do you, depending on locations or sites, see a potential for solar and wind developers, especially onshore wind developers, cooperating on either projects or transmission, and also especially if we look at energy storage, because you look at the, solar during the day, often wind resources strong at night, energy storage could make a lot of sense there.
Yes, for sure. So Long Road is, we are backed by the New Zealand Citizen Pension Fund, the superannuation fund, so we're deploying about $150 million of capital in the United States, and we're doing about 60% solar and 40% wind. And the solar, we have actually gotten to the point where we said, oh yeah, we're all in on this wind project, and then flipped it and turned it into a solar project. So we've got a 250 megawatt solar project in Texas that was once a wind farm. So yes, and I think your point about co-locating potentially or creating a storage product to kind of avoid some of the potential congestion issues, which I think are really poised to plague the market kind of across the country. We have to have a toolkit of solutions to be able to present to our customers, because if we can't solve that problem, our customers are not going to take the congestion risk. We are. So we have to be able to either get paid to deal with, to handle storage, or like 3M or a big corporate, they're not going to take the risk. So it's a great question.
And the other value of storage, I don't think, at least at EDF, we haven't seen it used as much for energy arbitrage, where you're saying we're generating more energy than we need at a certain, during the evening, so we'll save it for 8 hours until we can sell it into the market. It's also been very valuable, we've seen in other markets, for some of those issues with renewables that Alan McBride was talking about with voltage support. So right now, I think you're starting to see storage really being used as a way of backing off some of the generation that you would have previously needed on the system. So if peak demand in ISO New England is 25,000 megawatts, there might be up to 35,000 megawatts of resources available to do some of those ancillary services. So as you can make the grid smarter, which includes battery storage for some of those other services you need, aside from just providing electrons, you can decrease the amount of overall backup you need on the system, as well as making renewables more valuable. So it's definitely where the market is headed in the next few years.
Hi, I'm Mike Mayhew from Heliotropic Technologies. My question is probably targeted to Carolyn, but I'd love to hear anybody's input. I just see a huge synergy with offshore wind in tidal, and tidal being very constant, and the fact you've got a transmission line going out, we've got all these aging plants that are on the coast and in transmission and distribution availability. Did you see any synergy in Europe as tidal is starting to take off? Or do you, the technology is so similar to wind that I just would think that would be a good piece.
It's a little while since I've been involved in the wave and tidal sector, but I certainly had some exposure to that back in the UK. Not only when I worked with the Crown Estate, who sort of helped to sort of set up the European Marine Energy Test Centre of Orkney, where a lot of these things are being trialled. But I also worked for Fred Olsen Renewables, and they have been supporting a tidal project, which is Scott Renewables, which is also based in Orkney. So I haven't seen really any talk about synergies in that respect, because I think the tidal industry has still got a long way to go. I mean, there's still a lot of demonstration projects, R&D going on. So, as I say, I've not been involved directly in that market for a few years now, but it's still very much, I think, still in that R&D pre-commercial scale sort of aspect at the moment.
Some of you are from Maine and you know this, but for the last 6 years we've had a governor who's not been very friendly to wind or solar or anything alternative. He effectively chased Statoil out of Maine, who then went to Scotland and invested billions. I'm wondering, in the next 2 years, when we get a new governor from either party and a new legislature, can we recover and sort of get back all the opportunities we might have had we been a little more aggressive, particularly with the declining incentives, specifically in Maine?
So I kind of alluded to that a little bit earlier when I first started speaking. I think we can recover, but I think that we need to do it relatively quickly and understand that the markets are shifting. The markets are shifting pretty rapidly, and as Southern New England continues to look for clean energy resources, they'd be very happy to take clean energy resources from Maine, but if we're not prepared and able to provide that to them, they will go and find it elsewhere. And we're already seeing the very early parts of that redirection in their attention. The demand is still great. It's greater than what they currently have resources lined up for. So that opportunity will continue to be there for the state of Maine, but it'll be there for a very limited amount of time, I believe.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think it really has been you just watch the steady kind of retreat of the industry based on the lack of support. But I think most urgent is the need for a new administration to kind of grab onto this industry and acknowledge it as a center of excellence in the state. So I think more than anything, it's just an opportunity that needs to be kind of grabbed and flipped. Because I look around the room and there's so many people, so much intellectual capital, so much opportunity around as you rightly note, Adam, the decrease in the costs. And Maine is uniquely situated between Canadian, it's a great piece of real estate between Canadian hydro and Southern New England markets. We've got sun, we've got wind. I mean, there's no reason, maybe we can do offshore here at some point when the technology improves. I think there's ample opportunity, and I think we could do it with the right folks in leadership. I just think you got to flip this whole thing around and stop comparing it to, stop saying what we don't want to do and start saying what we do want to do. And I think it's very ripe to turn around.
Really, just to add, I suppose, I think from the offshore perspective, it's good to take that regional perspective, and I think Val spoke about the work that she's involved in with the other states as well. And I think for offshore wind, that's an interesting area to look at, as well as how the states can work together to really sort of create the supply chain and go forward.
I think we have
Yeah,
one more.
one more question. Brooke from the Allen Institute. We work with communities up and down the coast. I'm just curious, for you as developers, what are you learning about how to work effectively with communities, either offshore or onshore?
Well, and again, I have probably the least experience in Maine, but I think there are some lessons that are applicable from a lot of the work I did in farming communities in Illinois. And I think you have to remember what else is important to them. I mean, obviously, everyone on this panel lives and breathes renewable energy, and so when I'm excited to come into a farming community and talk about what great revenue it will be on a per acre basis and how it'll help meet larger sustainability goals that the state or nation may have, but then they're like, okay, that's great. I'm glad I'm going to get a check from this every year. But remember, I have 500 acres. You're using 10. The other 490 are going to be used for farming. And if even if you do best construction practices, you're still going to break my drainage tile. You may still, if you site your road improperly, then my 40-foot combine is now chunking up into, it has to plant smaller rows. And so just really understanding that the communities do have a life outside of renewable energy, and think very long and hard about how you can make it as compatible as possible. And then when those economic benefits look completely additive and are disrupting the rest of their lives as little as possible, it should be a home run for the community.
I think from the offshore perspective, I mentioned earlier the importance of working with stakeholders and actually, as early as possible in the process as well. Because, offshore wind is new to the US. There are a lot of other marine users out there using that marine space. And even though some of the wind energy areas have been identified by a process that involves sort of federal and state agencies, it doesn't mean that they're not areas that haven't got challenges in working with stakeholders. And I referred to the importance of working with the fishing community in particular, because they are a significant marine user. And the earlier you get out to talk to those interests and those communities, the better. And I think the important thing is to listen to people's concerns and to take those concerns on board. There is a huge role to play in sort of educating different marine users about what offshore wind is all about, what it looks like. Doesn't necessarily exclude people from those wind energy areas by any means. But we have to coexist with those other stakeholders. Navigation and shipping is another key area that we have to work with. So I think when people first see those wind energy areas on the map, they think that those, hundreds of thousands of acres are going to be full of offshore wind turbines. Well, that's not the case. So I think it's just working with the stakeholders as early as you possibly can, and to understand their concerns and listen to those concerns and address them.
Yeah, completely agree. I think we learned some pretty tough lessons along the way in various projects in Maine. I think one of the key ones was starting early and making sure that folks in the community knew exactly what you were talking about doing. And then I think also taking it out of the atmosphere, kind of out of the high altitude discussion and translating it very quickly into, like, let's do a site walk. Everybody's invited to bring a snowmobile and meet me on top of the ridge on Saturday, and we'll talk about it. That stuff is just helpful as part of the learning process. And then I think codifying, that's sort of early stuff, but then actually codifying that into a real process whereby input is taken. Alec Jarvis, who's here, I think is with Calpine now, developed and Dave Fowler, who's I think out on his own now, both worked for First Wind, and they each developed their own kind of unique community outreach processes, and they were rigorous, like multi-month, town-wide, people coming home off a truck route dirty clothes, kind of grandma in curlers, standing at the, kind of at the in the gym, and talking about the project. And you have to do that. And it's so important. And that's kind of why I say I think ultimately we graduated through a pretty tough school of hard knocks on community outreach. And you kind of settle into a routine whereby, okay, well, here's kind of how they do it, and then we're going to have the Hoosiers kind of style gymnasium discussion, and then we're going to, retain consultants on behalf of the community to evaluate our DEP application. And we learned a lot, with DEP, a lot of back and forth with DEP on it, and LRC at the time when they were jurisdictional. And it takes listening, and we've certainly learned a lot over the years. And I know, Paul is doing a lot of the same stuff, so it's really critical.
Yeah, so sometimes I wish I do it better. And this is kind of repeating what everybody already said, one of the key things that we need to do is set realistic expectations so that people understand what both may happen, but also in some cases may not happen. And what kind of keeps me up often at night and where I cringe is when 3 hours after I talk to somebody, I realize I forgot to mention something, and I need to go back and I need to correct that with them and apologize for not stating it correctly the first time. And so that's really, the heart of one of the things I'm frequently reminding myself is set realistic expectations. Don't promise the moon and the sun. Don't promise everybody that they're going to get a chunk of something if they're not going to. If there's any uncertainty, let them know that there's uncertainty. Let them get a real clear idea of what it looks like. Show them pictures. All of those sort of things are very important.
I think you're right. We, as developers, we never stop learning ourselves, do we? from those experiences. And and that's again what makes it exciting, because no two projects are the same.
And I think what you're hearing is what makes these 4 developers so successful in their field: listening, adapting, being creative, being sincere, and having your veracity be one of the prime principles when you're dealing with stakeholders, with regulators, with anyone who might be involved in your project. And I just want to thank you all for appearing here today, and they'll be around for a little while, and there's some food outside, I believe.
I just wanted to come up one more time. I'd like to recommend that everybody take one of these brochures. You'll see the names, the organizations and companies, the descriptions of all the speakers that we had today, so that you can go back to them with questions and get more information. Also want to thank our sponsors one more time: Stantec, Dong Energy, Eaton Peabody, Avangrid Renewables, NECEC, Sprague, and the Portland Press Herald. As Brooke mentioned, we have a networking lunch right now, so I hope you can all stick around for the next 45 minutes, hour, catch some lunch, and speak some more with our presenters. Thank you. Good.